How do you keep something secret? You hide it in plain sight.
There were bodies that were involved with some of these crashes, also some were alive.
I'm a doctor in an ER taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks. And I'm being asked to brief the CIA director on stuff because he and the president are being lied to? What? If the average person knew that the term UFO was actually concocted after they knew that they were extraterrestrial vehicles or man-made anti-gravity devices, they would realize that for 60 years we've already had the solution to the environmental crisis, the energy crisis, and global poverty. The most dangerous thing going on the planet today isn't ISIS, it's not Iraq, it's not Russia, it's not China. It's a out-of-control, covert group that is not being overseen by the people, the Congress, or the president, who have developed these technologies and are recklessly using them to track and target extraterrestrial vehicles. The result of this is that we're in a crisis that is unacknowledged, ironically, because these projects are unacknowledged.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
There is no threat, and we have to prevent the weaponization of space.
So either they don't exist, but if they are, they're a threat. So this is the 1-2 punch that's been going on, unfortunately, for 60-some years. He said, do you know why they killed Marilyn?
Mr. President, the late Marilyn Monroe.
And I said, well, I didn't until I got this document. It's a virtual death warrant.
When they found out that Tesla had passed away, they came in, they had the manager of the hotel open the safe, and they took all of Tesla's papers.
Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, that's an urban myth or a conspiracy theory. I say, like the hell it is. This is like a bad, conspiracy novel, except this became my life.
I have over 3,000 cases now.
They estimated 100 yards from the left wing was this 100-foot disc.
And the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge.
The size of these objects around 100 meters or greater.
So it would go from 1 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles to 6, 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles inside of 4 or 5 seconds. You have to be moving pretty quickly.
They could rise, just go straight up. They could do that, just seemed like instantaneous.
Once they started moving, they went straight up, for a while, and then they went zap.
Then it just sort of disappeared, it dematerialized.
And left the atmosphere, just was gone. It just took off into space.
It just left at high speed.
He said, you are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this never happened.
And you never saw this, and I don't exist, and this situation never happened.
I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy.
So I was beaten, literally hitting in the ribs and pushed, and I was resisting. And I know Sergeant Bustinza was doing the same thing.
Measures have been taken by agencies to terminate people who appear to be inconvenient or troublesome through knowing too much.
Whatever activity is going on, to the extent that it is a clandestine group, a quasi-government group, a quasi-private group, it is without any type, as far as I can tell, of high-level government oversight. And that is a great concern.
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest
free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
We have contact with aliens not originating from some foreign country, but from some other solar system. And I have been a party to that.
My name is Dr. Stephen Greer. I am the director of the Disclosure Project, which is a project of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is a project which we have been working on since 1992. And during this time, we have identified over 400 military, intelligence, and corporate witnesses to special access projects within the United States and elsewhere that deal with what the public has called UFOs, extraterrestrial intelligence, and advanced energy and propulsion systems. The purpose of this executive briefing is to put together some of this witness testimony. I want to emphasize that out of the over 400 witnesses whom we have identified, that we have interviewed to date on camera approximately 100. Of those, 120 hours of videotape have been created of testimony from these witnesses. This executive summary can only contain a very small tip of the iceberg, less than 1/2% of the possible testimony which we have. But it will give you an idea of the extent of the knowledge of these men and women who have come forward heroically to tell the world, to tell our elected representatives and our scientists the truth about a subject which has been the subject of much ridicule, fantasy, and speculation for over 50 years. We will present 3 essential areas. Number 1, what is the evidence? What is the testimony support? What is the case file support? And what do the government documents support? We will also then move on to something a little more difficult to explain, and that is the mechanism for secrecy. How has something of this import been kept secret from our representatives, and how has it been kept off the national and international radar screen effectively for over 50 years? Without understanding this, the evidence itself has no foundation, because any rational person will conclude that this couldn't be true, or we would know about it, that the government leaks secrets like a sieve, and that indeed, if any of this were true, many of the people in society, in high places in our government, would know about it, when in fact they do not. So the secrecy around this issue, which has been extraordinary, must also be explained, and it will be. And the third component is the why. Why has it been kept secret? What are the implications? I will remind you that a very conservative Republican 2-term president and 5-star general, Dwight Eisenhower, said that we should be careful of the excesses of the military-industrial complex. We now have learned, and you will hear testimony to this effect, that one of his chief concerns were that special access projects within the military and intelligence sector dealing with this subject were escaping the legal constitutional oversight of the American Congress and indeed of the American presidency. He stated this in January of 1961.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
Eisenhower's warning has really come full circle to this date, where we now see extraordinary funds being put into projects and being withheld from the American public, which if released could give us indeed an entirely new and sustainable civilization. These propulsion and energy systems used for peaceful purposes would enable the world to get off of its dependency of fossil fuels, oil, and the internal combustion engine, and have a truly non-polluting, sustainable civilization for thousands of years. The implications of this statement cannot be overstated. We are really talking about the ability of our civilization to move within a generation from a world which is facing environmental collapse, oil shortages, rolling blackouts in some of our states, and eventually growing world tension over a shrinking oil supply while demand skyrockets over the next 10 to 20 years. That grim scenario can easily be replaced by the declassification and peaceful application of these technologies. In addition to this, we have to consider what the risks are if we do nothing. The technologies, which are in compartmented secret programs that have been derived from studying extraterrestrial technologies as well as human innovations, which deal directly with energy generation and propulsion systems, are technologies which would enable the entire planet to begin to work in an integrated function and in a way that does not lead to greater and greater spiraling gaps between the rich and the poor. Beyond this, there is something of even greater concern. One of the witnesses whom you will hear from is a person who worked directly with Wernher von Braun, the very famous rocket scientist and space explorer, who warned on his deathbed that there were people planning to put weapons in space or to have space-effective weapon systems, which would be used in a hoax scenario from a threat, a hoax threat, that would be of extraterrestrial origin. There is no evidence that we are under any threat from any civilization from outside our solar system or within our solar system. However, there is a lot of evidence from this testimony that there are people who are deliberately trying to weaponize space under the guise of many situations which are really hoaxed scenarios. This is dangerous because if we are not alone in the universe, we cannot view space as our own private domain for Homo sapiens. We must view space as a frontier which must be shared peacefully with diverse life forms from throughout the universe. One of the points I would like to make also about these cases is that we must accept the testimony of all of these witnesses. The reason we must is that if we begin to dismiss dozens of military intelligence officers, corporate officials, as well as people within other walks of life who have professional credentials, their testimony on this issue, then it brings into question how we view witness testimony on many other things. If we use that same standard, every murder conviction in the United States should be overturned, which has been based on witness testimony. We would also, as Monsignor Balducci at the Vatican has pointed out to us, throw out the entire Bible, since that is almost totally based on human witness testimony of the people who wrote down the accounts during the times of Christ and his predecessors.
Storico è vissuto un uomo che si chiamava Gesù.
Can show that at a certain historical point lived a man named Jesus.
E questa dimostrazione si basa sulle testimonianze degli storici.
And in the end, this is based on human witness testimonies.
Perché come facciamo a sapere che quel Vangelo è di quello lì, quell'altro di quello là?
And how do we know that this gospel is from that man and this gospel is from this man is true?
E sono le testimonianze che
And they
abbiamo
are the testimony and the witnesses of those people.
Per cui, se si indebolisce il valore della testimonianza
If you
umana,
start taking apart and destroying the value of human witness testimony,
le conseguenze sono anche gravi, gravissime, tragiche per la religione, specie per la religione cristiana.
the consequences are grave, tremendous, especially for Christian religion.
I should emphasize that this human testimony is key, and in a sense is more important than any physical evidence because it is multiple, it is corroborating, and it can not be tossed out in a cavalier fashion. We should be very careful that we do not ignore this testimony because the testimony of these men and women serves as a significant body of evidence with corroboration of photographs and other government documents. To introduce this part of the videotape, which deals specifically with pilots, radar cases, cases that involved telemetry and related technologies, I wish to emphasize that for decades, people who have been skeptical of this subject have claimed that if these objects were real, they would have been tracked on radar. We have no fewer than 20 witnesses from the Air Force, the Marines, the Navy, the Army, as well as civilian authorities in the United States and abroad, who are qualified air traffic controllers and pilots who have seen these objects on radar. Please note that these people absolutely will state that these have not been weather balloons, they have not been air inversions, they have not been swamp gas. They have been structured craft traveling at thousands of miles per hour, then suddenly stopping, hovering, or moving in a nonlinear fashion, where these objects have been tracked and going from one spot to 500 miles away or further within one radar sweep. Commander Graham Bethune piloted his plane across the North Atlantic in 1951. The testimony you will hear is important and significant for a number of reasons. The object was very close. It was in 1951 and was tracked on radar moving at 1,800 miles per hour, a speed which no craft in the world could move at that time in those speeds. Additionally, we've been able to locate his co-pilot as well as documents from the government of his official debriefing and report, which was made by the Navy and the military at that time.
The flight was normally about 10 hours, but that night we had a 60-knot wind, and it was a headwind. And about maybe 300 to 400 miles outside of Keflavik, out of Argentia, I'm sorry, I saw something below the horizon on the water that looked like approaching a city at night. It was just kind of an ambient light, no definition whatsoever, but the same thing that you would see if you were approaching a large city at night. And all of a sudden we saw on the water a yellow halo that was very, very small, about 15 miles away. And it came up to 10,000 feet like that, a fraction of a second. And I thought it was going to go right through us. And I disengaged the autopilot, pushed the nose over because I was going to go under it at the angle it was coming toward me. So what happened, the minute that I did that, it was up at our altitude and I could see nothing outside of the cockpit but this craft. And so I didn't know which way to go. And then all of a sudden I heard a racket. I didn't know what it was. And I said, "Fred, what the hell was that?" He looked around, he says, "Oh," he said, "everyone was ducking in the back of us and they collided and they're all laying on the deck back there scrambling on the deck." So when I looked back, it wasn't there. And he says, "It's over here on the right-hand side." Now, it was about a mile or so away on the right-hand side, and it kind of drifted forward maybe to a position maybe 5 miles away, and that's where it stayed with us for quite some time. This is when we could first see, it wasn't above our altitude, it was below our altitude, but it's still above the horizon where you could see the side of the craft, you could see the dome, and you could see the color around the perimeter of the craft. And then we knew that it was a friendly encounter. I said, "Doc, did you see what we saw?" And he says, "Yeah." He says, he looked me straight in the eye. He says, "Yeah." He says, "It was a flying saucer." So I went back forward and I said, "Al, whatever you do, don't tell anybody we saw anything. I'll lock us up as soon as we get on the ground." He said, "It's too late." He said, "I just called Gander to control to see if they could track this by radar." So that's how it got out. So when we landed at Argentia, the Air Force was there and they interrogated us. And the captain that did the interrogation did a real good job, but you could tell that this wasn't his first time that he'd ever interrogated anybody as far as these craft were concerned. When that question was asked, it was 300 feet that came in my mind. And when I got the report out of the archives in 1991, I'd never seen anybody else's report. Everyone had been anywhere from 250 to 350 feet in diameter. Now, the velocity when it left us was estimated from between between 1,000 miles an hour to 2,000 miles an hour. And when I looked at the report, Al Jones estimated 1,800 miles an hour. Mine was 1,000, another one was 1,500 miles an hour, in that range. It turns out that the radar report, which I've never seen, said it was 1,800 miles an hour. So the other plane commander was sitting in the seat, took my seat, he hit it right on the nose. Now my boss, that's another thing. When he found the report in the archives in Wright-Patterson on Project Blue Book, and talking to Colonel Watson, when he came back to me, he gave me the speed of 1,800 miles. I said, where did you find that out? And he said, well, it was a radar report that said that. The document that I found was the official document that the Air Force had put together, different sources that came to them. And it was originally filed, it was under Project Grudge, you can see in their written Project Grudge, but on the front page it says Project Twinkle. Now this is where they put a lot of ones that they had to get rid of somehow. It was Project Twinkle. So it was in Project Blue Book and Project Grudge and what other project I don't know that was in.
Michael Smith was an air traffic controller with the Air Force, both in Oregon as well as subsequently in Michigan. At both of these facilities, he witnessed UFOs tracked on radar moving in extraordinary speeds, and he also confirms that NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, was fully apprised of these events, and in fact, in one of these events in Michigan, was engaged and steered B-52s returning to a base around the UFOs, which were at low altitude and were intersecting the flight path of these B-52s. This man has a very good career, and he has documented his placement at these facilities at the time that these events occurred. It establishes the physical reality of these objects, and also, I should note, the fact that NORAD has been involved. This is of some significance since we have learned that President Clinton, ex-President Clinton, had asked Webster Hubbell, when he was third in command at Justice, to look into the UFO issue. And when Webster Hubbell and others made inquiries to NORAD, they denied any knowledge of these objects. This is serious because if these senior covert projects are lying to directed inquiries from the President of the United States, this constitutes a serious breach in our chain of command.
In spring of 1970, while I was stationed in Klamath Falls, Oregon, I came up to the radar site on the evening shift, and where there's normally 2 or 3 people in the radar room, there was quite a few, from the cooks to maintenance, all kinds of people. And I asked what was going on, and they said that they was watching a UFO. And I immediately was stunned and asked if the Pentagon was notified. Somebody called the president, and they said no, they don't do that. It was stationary, wasn't moving at all, and it would slowly lower itself down until it got behind a mountain, so you lost radar contact. It would stay down for about 15 minutes, and the next thing you knew, it was right back up there. It was up, 80, 90,000 feet. And then the next sweep of the radar scope, it would be, like 200 miles away, stationary, completely stopped. And I said, well, we should call the news media or, call somebody. This is earth-shaking news. And to me, and he just said, no, just calm down. NORAD knows about it. They called NORAD. And that's when the senior NCO pulled me to the side and said that NORAD knows about it. That's the only people we notify. We don't talk about this. We don't tell anybody about this. The people that know. And we just watch, see what happens, and that's it. And I insisted, well, there has to be a report filed or something filed, And they said, well, that there is a report that you can file. It's about 1 inch thick. And the first 2 pages is about the sighting. The rest of it is basically a psychological profile of you, your family, your bloodlines, everything. So when the Air Force goes through it, they can discredit you completely by either saying that you was on drugs, or your mother was a communist, or anything to discredit you, and you'd never get a promotion. And I'd spend the next 3.5 years up at the North Pole, living in a tent checking the weather balloons. My second encounter was while I was stationed in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. It was in 1972. I was working alone that night when I got a phone call from the switchboard operator. He said he had the state police on the phone and wanted to talk to me. He was real frantic when he got on the phone and said that there's 3 UFOs over the north tower of the Mackinac Bridge. So I immediately, turned on the radar. When they asked if I had it on radar, I told them no. It's more of a programmed response, thinking back to Klamath Falls, where you're told you don't talk about it, you don't write it down, you don't discuss it. And in the meantime, I called NORAD and told them, and they looked it up, and they said, oh, it's coming up, they're going up I-75. I said, yes, at about 70, 80 miles an hour. Now, about halfway between St. Nicholas and Sault Ste. Marie, there's Kinchlow Air Force Base, which is a SAC base, which they have B-52 bombers. They had 2, apparently, that were on final approach, and that crosses I-75. And so, apparently, they diverted those 2 bombers because they didn't want, if they have nuclear weapons or not, but they didn't want to take a chance on them meeting UFOs about the same altitude crossing the highway. So they diverted the 2 B-52s. It was a real eye-opener, how deep the secrecy goes, how deep the cover-up is.
Enrique Kolbick is a senior air traffic controller at Mexico City International Airport. He testifies that up to the current day, that these objects are tracked on radar at Mexico City International, moving at extraordinary speeds, and at times as many as 12 to 15 of them have been seen on radar at the same time. They are being visually seen by pilots and, in one case, photographed by civilians. He also states that one event involved 32 air traffic controllers who saw the same event. These are trained professionals in a very busy international airport.
We have registered information about 12 or 15 echoes at the same time. A lot of pilots in reports when immediately to have a sighting, to have problems with his instruments of flight, precisely the electronic instruments. The pilots reports the size of these objects around 100 meters or greater. Our radar, and at the same time, like in other radars in the world, doesn't detect light. Only objects, solid objects flying. That is very important. We have 2 Mexican aircrafts flying, bound to the, coming from the north to the airport, flying to land. When one of them reports to have inside a small object of red color flying faster and passing beside him very fast, and the aircraft that was flying behind of the first reports to have another war inside, and they have visual contact with these 3 different objects, different color. Was red, and the other 2 white. Around 32 controllers have the same sighting, the same phenomenon inside. This kind of phenomenon appears sometimes 12 times a day, 12 times a month, or at the week. This phenomenon of course, doesn't come with a flight plan. Nobody knows nothing about them. Appears when they wants to appear.
Chuck Sorrells is a career Air Force military man who was at Edwards Air Force Base in 1961 when not one, but at least 7 UFOs were over Edwards Air Force Base airspace, moving in extraordinary nonlinear fashion at enormous speeds, making right-hand turns and other maneuvers which no known aircraft could do. They were on radar, they were seen visually, and a special UFO officer scrambled and authorized a jet to intercept these objects. They were present between 1:30 a.m. and dawn, meaning that this event lasted for 5 or 6 hours.
At about 1:30 or so in the morning, I noticed this real bright light to the east of my field, and it was kind of a light green, I would describe it, and it had a red light underneath it, and the red light, it wasn't actually a flashing light, it's kind of, I'd say, pulsating type, probably be a better description of it, red underneath, and it had a white like light on top that just glowed. And I had the one of the detachment guys from the interceptor detachment that was on the base there, had the captain down there, got him awake and got him to go out and look at it. And yeah, what is that, you know? And so we talked about it for a while. And RAPCON people, that's radar people that on the base, they didn't have any aircraft in the area at the time. And so we called it down to the air defense people at Los Angeles Air Defense Sector. And the director down there decided, he got to call them around his sites, and at one point in time they had at least 4 different radar sites that were getting radar returns on these things. And then all of a sudden there's like 3 more objects, and they had similar characteristics as far as the lighting is concerned, but these 3 stayed like together. They stayed like, I don't know if they were formation or what it was, but anyway, these 3 stayed together, and then they stayed there for a little bit, and then they moved down to the south of me and set there stationary a while. And then a little bit later on, there's 3 more appears, but these 3 are individual ones, and so at this point I had like 7 of them. This goes back and forth for I don't know, 2-3 hours. And they finally decided to scramble an aircraft on it to go up and take a look at it. And this was coordinated with the other higher headquarters, and I think NORAD was involved and everybody. Well, about 3 different times that night, he was able to, he'd say contact. And that contact means he had contact with something on his radar in the cockpit of the aircraft. But these objects played around there for the remainder of my ship, and they just disappeared into the atmosphere. I know a lot of things this was not. I know it was not a helicopter. I know it was not an airplane. I know it was not a balloon, a weather balloon or any other type of balloon. And I know it was no known aircraft, flying object that we know of today, or at that time. And it wasn't a laser show, it wasn't anything like that. But they could move real fast. They could move from the east, they could be to the east of my field, and in just a short period of time, they could be to the west. They could probably go 30 or 40 miles in time you could snap your fingers twice. I mean, just fast.
Colonel Charles Brown is a career Air Force officer, a hero of World War II, and worked specifically in Project Grudge. This is a project which for many people didn't really exist, but it did. And his testimony not only proves its existence, but also he will state and you will hear how the project had definitive cases and evidence, cases that involved ground radar, air visual, and ground visual all at the same time in the same event. And as he said, it doesn't get any better than that.
Basically because of my counterintelligence training and police work in an outfit called Office of Special Investigations. Since I had one of the few pilot trained investigators, I ended up doing a lot of investigations of unusual aircraft accidents in which sabotage was suspected. And as a consequence, became acquainted with some outstanding scientists and worked with the Air Technical Intelligence Center on a project called GRUDGE. At that time, Office of Special Investigations was a worldwide investigative unit in the Air Force and were given the responsibility of investigating what became known as unidentified flying objects. And my job was to hand carry these reports over to the technical center and coordinate them with the project officer, answer any questions from an investigative viewpoint that I could assist on. Some of the objects reported were tracked on radar. We had objects with four-way confirmation: ground visual, ground radar, airborne visual, airborne radar. And so far as I'm concerned, you don't get no better than that. I do remember speeds in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 miles an hour, which were far in excess of any known aircraft that we had or any of the enemies. There's no question, I've seen radar photographs of organized flights of unidentified objects, balls of light, if you will. And these were on radar, ground visual, ground radar, airborne visual, airborne radar. Now the airborne visual, strangely enough, by the time they get a couple of fighters down there, those things apparently disappeared whenever they wanted to.
Mr. John Callahan is a senior FAA official. He was third or fourth down from the top of the FAA underneath Admiral Ingram at the time in 1986 that a major UFO event happened over Alaska. He will state that these objects were indeed on radar, that they were tracked moving in extraordinary nonlinear fashion and at speeds unattainable by any conventional propulsion system, and that the CIA, at a meeting with the admiral who headed up the FAA and the science advisors for President Reagan, at the end of the briefing, took all the evidence and said, quote, "This meeting never happened, this event never happened, and we were never here." I wish to emphasize that John Callahan is one of those senior government officials that people are always asking about. Where are they? Why don't they come forward? Well, Mr. Callahan has come forward, and his testimony is definitive. In addition to John Callahan's testimony, we have an enormous amount of material which he had kept from his days at the FAA as a senior official there. These include the pilot's report of the encounter, the actual videotape of the radar tracings, the FAA report which was generated, and transcripts of the air traffic controller talking to the Japan Airlines 747 captain, a military pilot, as well as subsequently a United Airlines pilot.
The way it started is there was a 747, the Japanese airline 747 was coming from the northwest going across the Alaskan territory. And he was at either 31, 33, or 35,000 feet. And it was, I want to say around 11 o'clock at night, but you can check the real times. He called and asked the controller if the controller had any traffic at his altitude. And the controller said no. Basically, it was a midnight operation. They didn't have too much traffic. And he said, well, something like, I have a target at my 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock position, about 8 miles. Now, in the 747, they have radar in the nose that picks up the weather outside there. So his radar is picking up a target. He sees this target with his eye, and the target, the way he described it, was a huge ball with lights running around it, and I think he said it was like 4 times as big as a 747. Well, when they read the reports that come through, the FAA has to protect themselves, so you can't say you saw a target, even though this is what he said. So they made him change his report to position symbols, which makes it sound like it wasn't really a target. The military controller has what they call height finding radar, and they have long range radar and short range radar. So if they don't catch it on one of their systems, they catch it on the other. And if you listen to the military man, at one time he said, I have it on the height radar, or my range radar, whatever he called it, which indicated that he had a target on his system. The Japanese pilot would say he's now at 11 o'clock, he's now at 1 o'clock, he's now at 3 o'clock, he was bouncing around, this guy here. And when he would say that, the military guy would cut in and say he's now at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and he would confirm the position. So it would go from 1 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles to 6, 7 o'clock, 7 or 8 miles inside of 4 or 5 seconds. You have to be moving pretty quickly. When it was all done, and we went back to Washington the next day, the administrator had called down and wanted to know if he had a problem or not. And my boss had told him, well, we took a video of it, and it looks like there might have been something there. The administrator, which was Ingen at the time, Admiral Ingen, he said, well, have you got that video with you? Can you show me the video? And I said, yeah, you just plug it in and play it. So we plugged it in for him. He started watching it, and after about 5 minutes, he told the staff, I canceled my, he had a meeting with someone in 15 minutes. He says, first he said, I'll be late, and then next it was cancel, and then I'm going to be here till this is over. So he watched the whole thing in just over half an hour. A few minutes later, the Admiral calls down and says, I set up a briefing tomorrow morning at 9 or 10 o'clock, what it was. In the round room, bring all the stuff you have, bring everybody up there, and give them whatever they want. And we want to get out of it, just let them do whatever they want to do with it. They brought in 3 people from the FBI, 3 people from the CIA, and 3 people from Reagan's scientific study team, and I don't know who the rest of the people were. But they were all excited. When they got done, they actually swore all these other guys into that this never took place. We never had this meeting, and this was never recorded. He said this is the first time they ever had 30 minutes of radar data on a UFO, and they're all itching to get their hands into the data and to find out what it is and what really goes. And if they come out and told the American public that they ran into a UFO out there, it would cause panic across the country, so therefore you can't talk about it. And they're taking all this data. So I said, okay, take all that data. That's what you want. But they took only what we had there. They didn't ask me if there was anything else that I had. They said they're taking all this data. And I said, fine. Now I had the original video that I took, and I had the pilot's report that came through, the first report, and I had the FAA's first report that was all downstairs on my table. They didn't ask for that, so I didn't give it to them. When they asked me what I thought, I told them that it looked like we had a UFO that was up there. The reason it wasn't on the FAA's tapes was because it was too large of an aircraft, and it was picked up as weather, so we wouldn't record it. That the pilot, the Japanese pilot, seen it. The Japanese pilot drew pictures of it. Eventually, they gave the Japanese pilot a hard time because of what he said. He was embarrassing his country. Our military controllers said they seen it. Our FAA controllers said they seen it. Our FAA controllers, after a period of time, came back and said they really didn't see a target. They saw something else, which makes it sound like somebody is helping them fill out their reports, and therefore that looks suspicious. My guess is, because of the way it was, it's not part of the military's operation anymore, that it was a UFO. But who do you tell that you were involved in a UFO incident without them looking at you like you ain't wrapped too tight?
Captain Kenju Teruchi was piloting a Boeing 747, Japan Airlines, from Paris, France to Tokyo over the polar route. And I interviewed him by phone. I'm the only civilian to interview this gentleman, after he and his crew had a major sighting over northern Alaska on their way to Anchorage to land for refueling. And as a result of his following the rules, which he did, making a report out, landing safely, delivering the cargo, being a good pilot, Japan Airlines asked him to not fly anymore. I have over 3,000 cases now. A certain proportion are certainly historical that I've not interviewed myself, because in some of them they're so old I wasn't even alive. I wasn't born yet. And many of them come from Project Blue Book, which is the official Air Force study of the subject. And I would say in half of the cases at least, the phenomenon appears to approach the airplane, not the other way around. It's as if the aircraft is the focus of attention or curiosity, if I may use that word, of the phenomenon. That the pilot's flying along, minding his own business, and something comes up alongside one wing for 15 minutes at cruise altitude, cruise speed, and then sometimes we'll flip over to the other wing, or stay right at the nose of the aircraft and then do barrel rolls along the flight axis. Some very interesting maneuvers. I could say that at least in the non-black programs, we could not do what these objects were reported as doing. As a result of this review of my AirCat files, I found a number of cases back in the 60s, for instance, when the Air Force was still heavily involved in this subject, where they stepped in and interviewed, let's use the word, commercial pilots, not just their own military pilots, but commercial pilots, and ended the interview by saying, "You're not to tell anybody about what you saw."
And I got off duty one night at midnight and went to bed, and I was called and told to come fix the radar. There was something wrong with it. And so when I got up to CIC and I asked them what the problem was, they said, well, we're tracking an aircraft here at 3,400 miles an hour. And I said, well, there is something wrong. So I took that radar offline, put the standby radar online, and went to work. And I started running all the tests, and everything was normal. So as a result of talking with them, I said, I can't find anything wrong with the radar. But there was clearly, they had clear plots, and they told me, this is an absolute stellar contact, because you usually get the size of the blips, usually do with either the size of the contact or the shape, something, and this was a blip that was better than a ½ inch across, which indicated a really large target, or something very close. So I asked the duty officer if he was going to report it, and he said no. And I said, why not? And he said, well, he says, you've just told me there's nothing wrong with the radar. You've run all the checks you can run. There's nothing wrong with the radar. We know we tracked the thing. If we report it, then Colorado Springs is going to ask us what's wrong with our equipment. And you've already said there's nothing wrong. So you and I then have a problem. We both are in trouble. We got to come up with a story. And he says, I'm not going to report it. It was one contact. That was it. So one night I was on the plot board. This was maybe 3 or 4 months later. And here comes this contact. And the second blip, you could see that this thing was moving. It was moving like 3 or 4 inches on a 360-mile scale. And so sure enough, I plotted it, and it was 3,400 miles an hour. And again, we didn't report it, but they says, there's nothing wrong. This is our friend back, and away we went. And nobody thought anything about it. It was interesting. We didn't make a big deal out of it, but we sure like to know what that was. It happened at least 3 more times that I had radar operator friends that would tell me, well, we had another one of those fast ones last night.
And I was flying a flight from San Francisco to Boston, the DC-10, and we were about halfway between Buffalo and Albany at 37,000 feet. All of a sudden the airplane started, it was on autopilot. The airplane started at about a 15-degree bank, turned to the left. And of course I looked out the window automatically, that's what you do when the airplane starts to turn. And I saw this brilliant light off. It's hard to tell exactly how far out it is, but it was very, very bright. And the first officer saw it, and the second officer got out of his seat, took a look. About that time, the first officer hit the autopilot release button and went back to manual control. And as I was looking out the window, why this thing that we had vision, this thing that we saw, disappeared back towards the left of the airplane and to our rear at a very rapid rate.
This next section of the video, of this briefing tape, is regarding the Strategic Air Command and nuclear facilities. I wish to emphasize that the witnesses we have here, again, are from diverse services. They range from the Atomic Energy Commission to people who have been at Strategic Air Command facilities and at missile launch control facilities throughout the United States and Canada. These witnesses give unmistakably clear testimony about the fact that these extraterrestrial vehicles appear to be quite concerned with our weapons of mass destruction. And in fact, more than one of these witnesses has stated to me that they believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles were there because they were very concerned that we might blow ourselves up or that we might begin to go into space and be a threat, perhaps someday, to other civilizations. Professor Robert Jacobs, as a respected professor at a major United States university, who back in the 1960s was in the United States Air Force assigned to Vandenberg Air Force Base. His testimony is corroborated by letters and documents we have from his commanding officer, Florence Mansman. This man was present when a special photographic array photographed a testing of an intercontinental ballistic missile. And as it reached subspace, this missile was intercepted by one of these extraterrestrial vehicles and was rendered inert. This was on film. The film was confiscated. They were told to be quiet about it. And the specific frames dealing with the UFO encounter with this missile were cut out by intelligence officers and were never seen again. Again, this witness, who has tremendous credibility, has corroboration from a now deceased senior military officer and subsequently a professor at Stanford University, Florence Mansman.
They counted down the missile. We heard engine ignition, lift off. We knew the missile was underway. And we were looking down southwest, and the missile popped up through the fog. It was just beautiful. And I hollered, "There it is." And our guys on our M45 tracking mount with 180-inch lenses on it got it. And the big BU telescope swung over and got it. And we followed the thing, and sure enough, we could see all three stages of powered flight as they burned out and dropped away. And then, of course, to our naked eye, all we saw was a smoke trail going off into subspace as it headed off toward its target, which was Eniwetok Island, Eniwetok Atoll. So we whooped and shouted and heard the film wrap off in the BU telescope and figured, well, that was our first big deal and we got it. We sent the film back down to Vandenberg, and I don't know exactly how long it was after the event. It might have been a day or two. I was called into Major Mansman's office at the 1st Strategic Aerospace Division headquarters. And I walked into his office, and they had a screen and a 16mm projector set up. There was a couch, and Major Mansman said, "Sit down," and there were two guys, as I recall, two guys in gray suits, civilian clothes, which was fairly unusual. And Major Mansman said, "Watch this." and turned on the film projector, and I watched the screen, and there was the launch from the day or two before at Big Sur. It was quite exciting because of the length of the telescope. As the Atlas missile entered the frame, we could see the whole third stage, which has two rocket nozzles like this and one in the center, a gimbaled one in the center, filling our frame from about 160 miles. That was pretty exciting optics. We watched that stage burn out, we watched the second stage burn out, we watched the third stage burn out, and into the frame came something else. It flew into the frame like this, and it shot a beam of light at the warhead, which is represented by my thumb here. Now, remember, all this stuff is flying at several thousand miles an hour. So this thing fires a beam of light at the warhead, hits it, and then this thing flies up like this. Meanwhile, we're all going like this, fires another beam of light, goes around like this, we're going like this, fires another beam of light, goes down like this, fires another beam of light, and then flies out the way it came in. And the warhead tumbles out of space. The object, the points of light that we saw, the warhead and so forth, were traveling through subspace about 60 miles straight up. And they were going somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 14,000 miles an hour when this thing caught up to them, flew in, flew around them, went like this, and flew back out. Everything was going about between 11 and 14,000 miles an hour that way. Now when the lights came on, Major Mansman turned around and looked at me and said, "Were you guys screwing around up there?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, "What was that?" And I said, "It looks to me like we got a UFO." Major Mansman, who was a very good reader of film, said that the feeling at the time was that it must have been extraterrestrial. That they assumed that the beam of light that struck the warhead, the dummy warhead, was some sort of plasma beam because it looked like a plasma beam. He said what happened is this. They took the film and they spooled off the part that had the UFO on it, and they took a pair of scissors and cut it off. They put that on a separate reel, they put it in their briefcase, they handed Major Mansman back the rest of the film and said, "Here, I don't need to remind you, Major Mansman, of the severity of a security breach. We'll consider this incident closed."
Colonel Ross Diedrichson had an illustrious career with the Air Force, which was followed by many years of service with the Atomic Energy Commission. During those years with the Atomic Energy Commission, he learned of specific incidents, not just one, but many, where these UFOs were over weapon storage areas, nuclear manufacturing facilities, as well as intercontinental ballistic missile sites. He also testifies that he learned specifically that we were planning to demonstrate our power to the Soviets by placing a nuclear missile on the moon and exploding it there, and that this missile was intercepted by extraterrestrial vehicles as it left Earth's atmosphere. This man has had a tremendous career, and we have documentation of his assignment not only in the Air Force, but at the Atomic Energy Commission. He is an elderly gentleman who is coming forward because he thinks this should be known by the world.
This is July of 1952. And of course, during that period of time, I made a lot of contacts. I was a staff officer for the Military Liaison Committee between the chairman of the AEC and the Secretary of Defense. And so I became acquainted with not only the Army, Navy, and Air Force, but civilian agencies, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and other contacts which I developed. During that period of time, one of my functions was to accompany a security team which visited all of the nuclear facilities to check on the security of weapons. And we were getting reports of visits by UFOs over the storage facilities and even some of the manufacturing facilities. Later, I was assigned to the Sandia Corporation as a military liaison, And I was involved in establishing a quality assurance program for the manufacture and the quality and the maintenance of the nuclear weapons. So we had to visit all of the manufacturing facilities, such as the Rocky Flats and the Pantex facility, which assembled the nuclear and non-nuclear components of the weapons. And so there again, we observed the UFOs were very much interested in the facilities that we were visiting. Almost cases where the UFOs became identified, at least on a radar or with reports, why they would try to scramble aircraft to intercept them. It was a very aggressive, you might say, response from our own government. Then I was assigned to the Unified Pacific Command under Admiral Felt during the 60s, and I was the officer in charge of the alternate command post involved in nuclear weapon operation planning. And during this period of time, I also learned of a number of incidents which happened. A couple of nuclear weapons sent into space were destroyed by the extraterrestrials. Our government sent a nuclear weapon for explosion on the moon's surface. It was tended to, as I understand it, to assess some scientific data and reaction and so forth. The idea of any explosion in space by any Earth government was not acceptable to the extraterrestrials, and that has been demonstrated over and over. And then further on, I finally retired from the Air Force and joined the Boeing Company, where I was assigned to the Minuteman program, where I was responsible for the configuration and accounting of all the nuclear fleet of Minuteman 1, 2, and 3. And during that period of time, I also learned about incidents involving nuclear weapons. The one incident, for example, was they actually photographed the UFO following the missile as it climbed into space and shining a beam on it, which neutralized the missile. And this was recorded. It was all hushed up, and they split up the team that observed it. But of course, eventually the news came out, and it was later published and confirmed it.
Lieutenant Colonel Arnie Arneson was present at a Strategic Air Command facility when one of these objects on radar was seen. He also learned that the intercontinental ballistic missiles were rendered inert during this and a related encounter. His testimony is corroborated by another military official, Robert Salas, who was present also at Malmstrom Air Force Base during an extraordinary event. The testimony of these two men, as well as the supporting documentation, establishes the reality of these objects and that they did have a deep concern with our nuclear facilities. In addition, they demonstrated that if necessary, they could render these intercontinental ballistic missiles inert.
I was a crypto officer for the entire Ramstein Air Base. I was a top secret control officer. And in that capacity, I happened to see a classified message go through my comm center which said that a UFO has crashed on the island of Spitsbergen, Norway, and a team of scientists are coming to investigate it. I do not recall where the message came from, where it was going to, because in that capacity, we were oftentimes told, what you see here, leave here. But I can recall seeing that. The next thing that comes to mind is one that took place in 1967. I was in charge of the Communications Center at 28th Air Division at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. I was, again, the top secret control officer there. I dispatched all the nuclear launch authenticator to the SAC missile crews and whatnot, so I had a very good top secret background to go on. One night, or one day I should say, I happened to see a message that came through my communications center. There again, I cannot quote the date, where it came from, where it was going to, but I do recall reading it and saying that basically that a UFO was seen near missile silo numbers I can't recall, but it was hovering there, and it said that the crew going on duty and the crew coming off duty all saw the UFO just hovering in midair. It was a metallic circular object, and from what I understand, the missiles were all shut down. They were in the missile silos, and they were being, I don't know what SAC does as far as activating a missile is concerned, but it's basically on a standby mode, so it can be launched. But when they say it went down, it means they went dead. And something turned those missiles off, and so they could not be put in a mode of launching.
The event, the incident, I guess I call it, is happened on the morning of March 16th, 1967. As I recall, it was early in the morning, and I received a call from my topside security guard, and he said that he and some of the guards had been observing some strange lights flying around the site. It wasn't more than, well, within a few minutes, I'd say, maybe a half hour later. He calls back, and this time he's very frightened. I can tell by the tone of his voice, he's very shook up, and said, "Sir, there's a glowing red object hovering right outside the front gate." He said, "I'm looking at it right now. It's a glowing red object. I've got all the men out here with their weapons drawn." And of course, he was all shook up while he was telling me this. He was very excited. I immediately went over to my commander, who was taking a nap. We have a little cot down there in a rest period. And I was telling him about the telephone call we just received. And as I was relating this to him, our missiles started shutting down one by one. There were approximately anywhere from 6 to 8 that went down, but they went down in rapid succession, which again is a extremely rare. And in the meantime, I called upstairs to find out what the status was of this object. The guard said, "Well, the object has left. It just left at high speed." Echo Flight is another squadron about, I'd say, 50, 60 miles away from our location. But they had the same sort of thing happen. They had UFOs that were hovering, not the launch control facility, but the actual launch facilities where the missiles are actually located. They had some maintenance and security people out there at the time, and they were observed. The UFOs were observed by these people out at those sites. Now, they lost all 10 of their weapons. So that morning, we lost anywhere from 16 to 18 ICBMs. At the same time, UFOs were in the area and were observed by airmen. This incident was of extreme concern to SAC headquarters because they couldn't explain it. Nobody could explain what happened. There is another incident that happened just within a week of this, week after, where there were radar reports and quite a few more witnesses.
So we all turn around, and they're sitting about, I'd say, a half a mile from the tower, and at about 3,000 feet was 3 silver UFOs, sitting in a farm. Was 2 here, then 1 covering the center. Once they started moving, they went straight up, for a while, and then they went zap. And they was off our scope, and our scope would go out to 260 miles. And so that, you calculate that, and that's pretty fast. I called headquarters, and the guy on the phone, and he says, I said, "Okay, we got a contact." And he says, "You mean SAC is running a mission against you?" I said, "Not SAC. Not SAC. What? And I said, Cosmos. He said, wait a minute. He said, scramble your phone. So there's a switch you could throw that scrambles everything of mine. And I said, okay, my phone's scrambled. Yours scrambled, mine's scrambled. You taking pictures, taking radar pictures, taking real pictures. He says, okay, don't say another word. He says, I will send a courier up there. He'll get there in about 6 hours. You turn everything over to him. We are never officially ever noted for those pictures that they ever received those pictures. It was just went secret. It went black, like it never happened.
And what we saw were 3 very bright but independent lights. I mean 3 separate lights. We assumed they were independent. And they were in a perfect, I guess, equilateral, a perfect triangle. The curious thing about this formation of lights that caused us to watch it for an extended period of time, 10 or 15 minutes we watched it, was that first it was silent. Second, it was moving slowly, but in a perfectly constant altitude, perfectly constant velocity, and perfectly constant direction from north to south. When I arrived at the command post the next morning at about 6:30 in the morning, it was unusually active and unusually well staffed. In fact, it was a beehive of activity, and there were people who had obviously been there most of the night. And it seems that these lights did position themselves over the alert force of B-52s, over the alert pad, where there were a specified number of B-52s configured for their wartime mission. And these lights were very interested in that wartime configuration, it would appear. And as sorties returned, I was told by those who had been there overnight, they were asked to close with and try to identify these lights. And this included B-52s, KC-135s, and even some of the F-106 interceptors that had been out doing their particular training missions as well. And the pattern was the same. Each time an aircraft would approach, the lights would depart in ways that defied any aerodynamic knowledge that anybody there had. Just rapid accelerations, rapid changes in direction, including vertical, and just doing things that something that is flying by the rules of aerodynamics that we understand would not have been at all possible. This whole event took from beginning to end probably in the range of 6 and perhaps more hours. And in retrospect, it is curious how quickly that subject just was dropped. It just wasn't discussed.
When I was a commander of a radar squadron up in Maine at Caswell Air Force Station, Maine, we were right next door to Loring Air Force Base, was where they launched the B-52s and the KC tankers and things like that. I had a lot of security friends over there at Loring who told me about, and I have no first-hand knowledge of it, but they also had seen UFOs hovering near the nuclear weapons storage area on Loring Air Force Base. And a lot of my technicians that worked for me as a communication electronics officer, they would tell stories about things going across the radar screens at fantastic speeds. You know, they were not, nothing could go that fast.
I was on mid-watch during my second med cruise, and it was about sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock, and I had a contact come on the radar scope. I knew the difference between surface search radar and air search radar. There's differences in polarity of the radio signal and things like this, and how the waves come back, all the stealth kind of stuff, you know, active and passive electronic countermeasures. So I know the difference between a flock of geese, or, you know, wave returns, or false echoes. In fact, this was the first thing that challenged me to check it out in ECM as to whether or not the contact I had on the scope was genuine. Because this was between 65,000 feet and above, and the strength of the signal was as strong as the surface contact on the water of an aircraft carrier. This contact was huge. It was got my attention, and the attention of others that were on watch. There were 4 enlisted on watch and 2 officers at the time. And so anyway, in this particular case, it was showing up on height finding equipment, and it was showing up on radar equipment. And then it began to move fairly slowly at first, and then very quickly. The CO came in, and he wanted to know what the heck was going on here, and they looked at it and asked what the hell was that, you know, and it got the attention of the captain at that time. Was Captain Clark, was my captain. My commander was Commander Gibson at the time. And there was only one person on watch in ECM, and before I knew, in a matter of 15 minutes, the ship was being turned, and 2 Phantom IIs were being prepared for launch. The Phantom IIs went to afterburners, and they were about 100 miles or so away from this contact, and turned on the conical scan radar to lock on, and it winked out. Just disappeared. After they land on the pipe, 35 minutes later, and everybody's settled down, this thing winks back on again, and it's about 12 to 15 miles from the ship, hovering at about 30,000 feet. And in any event, they went out, and the lookouts couldn't see anything. Nobody could see anything. But it was there on our radar scope. It was not a false signal. And my SEAL told me, Jordan, this, you know, what have you got in your log? This never happened. And I wasn't the only one there on watch that night. So anybody who was there at that time knows what I'm talking about, and knows that it's the truth. But less than a dozen people knew what went on that night, and that ship had 5,000 men on it. There were documents that I have seen that refer to the Roosevelt having several instances of UFO flyovers, and particularly after they took on board nuclear weapons. And I was on board when they did take those on for the first time.
This particular night, I took a message off the teletype and filed it because it was not to us, and I turned around to check the teletypes again and saw something I had never seen before, and that was that all 8 teletypes were just typing complete garbage, totally incoherent. So I immediately called the facilities control on the intercom to inform them that my broadcasts were out, and they informed me that they were busy because all communications had just gone out, ship-wide. The propulsion system still worked. We could maintain the speed and course, and we could steer, but from all the stories that I heard, anything that was electronic in nature ceased to operate. A few seconds later, we heard we had an intercom and a pneumatic tube system that went between the communications room to the signal bridge, which was located on the very top of the island structure of the carrier. And we heard a voice come on, very excited, yelling that God was here. It was the end of the world. And we looked at each other and thought, well, that's strange. What's going on there? Another few seconds went by, and another voice came on, more controlled. This person said that there's something over the ship, is what he said. There's something over the ship. Well, I looked at a friend of mine, a shipmate, and he looked at me, and we decided to go have a look. We observed a large glowing sphere over the island structure of the ship, over the ship. It was hard to decide what size this thing was because there was no perspective. It was late in the evening. The sun had gone down. It was twilight. But it looked huge. I would say anywhere from 300 or 400 feet to a quarter of a mile, depending on how high it was. It glowed in a pulsating manner between a yellowish and an orangish color. I couldn't see any details other than a glowing spherical object. Unfortunately, I only got to observe this object for less than 30 seconds because by the time we got out there and started looking at it, general quarters went off on the ship, battle stations. We had to go back to our watch station, which was our battle stations. A few days later, the commanding officer and the executive officer came on the closed circuit television system that we had on board. It was the only way they could address the crew of 5,000. He looked at the camera, and I'll never forget this. He looked at the camera and he said, "I would like to remind the crew that certain events that take place on board a major naval combatant vessel are considered classified and should not be discussed with anyone without any to know." Some men arrived on the ship when we returned to Norfolk to interview some people in suits. Lord knows where they came from, what agency they were from. I'm convinced that there's something to it. I'm convinced that the government, somebody in the government knows a lot more than we know.
Merle Shane McDowell worked for the United States Navy in 1981 and had a top secret SCI, Special Compartmented Intelligence clearance with zebra stripes. What this means is that he was one of a few people cleared to be in the command center at the Atlantic Command Facility near Norfolk, Virginia, during very critical events, including thermonuclear war. Merle Shane McDowell's testimony establishes that an object came in off the northern North American coast, was tracked on 4 or 5 radar stations, that jets were scrambled from multiple facilities to intercept and to attempt to force down this object which came from space. He will also testify that this object moved in one radar sweep from off the northern coast of North America to off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, and then down to off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida. Admiral Harry Train, who was Commander-in-Chief, Atlantic Command, was present during this event, witnessed it, and was involved in scrambling jets to intercept and to attempt to force down this object.
I was granted, after a 6-month wait, a top secret special compartmented intelligence clearance with a zebra stripe identification badge, which permitted access to all facilities on the base at all times. It's the highest level of alert that the Navy has or had at that time for dealing with generally dealing with global nuclear threats. When you set a condition zebra, whether it's a drill or not, people who are not authorized to be there who do not have a zebra access badge, it's a zebra stripe badge on your clearance badge, they have to leave the command facility, and we have Marines stationed outside the building there, in the building and as well as outside, that were under orders to shoot any unauthorized personnel that remained in the command center. They would announce it beforehand: this is a drill, set condition zebra. And unauthorized personnel would be escorted out of the command center if they didn't already know that they had to leave. But they turned the lights down this time, and they didn't say this is a drill. There's a door right here, and this guy, the Marine, comes in and wants to know what's going on. Is this a drill or so forth? They've got orders to start shooting people. And I know because I actually got the junior OOD's attention and said, "Hey, you guys need to tell this guy something. He's ready to start shooting people," because they haven't told him to stand down yet, and which he did. And I remember, wanting to just get the hell out of there. We had contact with an unidentified flying object that had entered our airspace. And at that point, when Admiral Train found out that it wasn't the Soviets, and that he wanted to know were the Soviets responding to this threat also, that was the moment that he gave authorization to put 2 planes up
to go see what this thing was. Pilots, you could hear the pilot's live voice transmissions being piped into the command center, visual confirmation on the object, description of the objects. Pilots were able to close a couple of times and be able to see that the object was not an aircraft that we were familiar with, was nothing that we had, was nothing the Soviets had, and that was determined very quickly. This thing absolutely had complete control of the situation and could just be wherever it wanted to be just in a matter of seconds. 1 minute we're, closing on it, off the coast of Maine. The next minute it's in Norfolk, headed south towards Florida. As Admiral Train was doing, he was scrambling, authorizing planes up just left and right, up and down the whole eastern seaboard. It headed out over the Atlantic, towards the Azores. I do remember them saying that it had pulled up at a 66-degree angle as it approached the Azores, like this, and it just pulled up at a 66-degree angle without slowing down or anything, and left the atmosphere, just was gone. It just took off into space and was gone, and just like that. The only descriptions that I recall that the pilots actually made were that they could not find any markings on the aircraft. They could not find any visible signs that the thing had wings, a tail, windows, a cockpit, or anything like that, or any markings from any country. They did get close enough to get some photographs taken that were later brought over to the command center. Well, from the photograph, I could remember the shape. What I would have said would have been, I would say a cylinder. I would say a cylinder because it was abrupt. It had abrupt ends. The ends didn't taper down like most aircraft.
When over one of the B-52s, which were armed with nuclear weapons, there appeared a bluish haze, almost in the form of a boomerang or a wing shape. And in this haze, there was a glittery light. We had no idea what this was. And we do know that the SAC teams were called to ready, so they came out to the plane. But prior to that, this just hovered over the plane for a short period of time and then just vanished. It wasn't as if you actually saw it glide away. It was like in a wisp, it was gone. This was something that actually showed up on radar, and the perimeter guard saw it, and the other people on the other post, because there's one person per B-52 bomber.
Astronaut Gordon Cooper is one of the heroes of our country. He witnessed not only a daytime UFO event in Germany, but in addition, while working and connected to the U-2 project at Edwards Air Force Base, his team had one of these objects land in broad daylight at Edwards Air Force Base. It was filmed. He oversaw this film being developed and sent to the Pentagon under special circumstances. Again, this is a hero of our country, astronaut Gordon Cooper, stating that one of these objects, a UFO, landed in the 50s at Edwards Air Force Base, and it was filmed. He saw the film, and it was sent back to the Pentagon. And his testimony cannot be contradicted because of the credibility that this great man has.
We were flying in Germany, and we were flying F-86s. And they would come over and do the same maneuvers that we make, except every once in a while one of them would go zip. And you just can't do that in a fighter, a conventional fighter. I was having some cameramen film the installation of a of a precision landing facility we were putting in right on the edge of the dry lake. And this saucer flew right over them and put down 3 little gear and landed out on the dry lake bed. And they went out to, picked up their cameras and moved on out toward him filming. And he lifted off, put the gear back in the well, and climbed out at a very high rate of speed and disappeared. And so while I was going through all the regulation books and finding out the number to call in Washington to report it, I had them go over and develop the film. By the time they got back with the developed film, I was on the higher and higher and higher level officer talking to me. Finally with the colonel telling me to, you know, when the film arrived at my desk, to put it in the carrier pouch. There would be a courier there at my office by that time already, and they'd arranged for him to fly in our base airplane back to Washington with these films. I had a chance to hold it up to the window and look at it. It was certainly a good film. I think they're for real. I think eventually we'll find out that there's regular travel here on this Earth from other planets.
Carl Wolf worked for the military and was at Langley Air Force Base as an Air Force technician during the 1960s. While there, and in his capacity working on some devices in a very secret area of Langley, he was shown by another technician photographs taken by the lunar orbiter prior to the lunar landing of structures on the moon that were specific, artificial, and constructed of stone and other materials. Some of them were very large, and he states are unmistakable evidence that someone had been on the moon before we landed in 1969, and that there are artificial structures on the moon.
My boss came to me. I was working in a color lab at that time. I was a technician, photographic technician. I was asked to go over to this facility on Langley Air Force Base where the NSA was bringing in the information from the lunar orbiter. And so I packed up some tools. I went over. I went into the facility. A couple of officers took me into this hangar. It was a very large hangar. So they took me into this laboratory. I took a look at the equipment. There was an airman second class in there. I was an airman second class as well. He turned the equipment on and put it through its paces. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. I saw what was going on with it. And I said to him, you know, we'll have to take this thing out of the lab if we're going to work on it. We can't work on it in here in the darkroom environment. So everyone left the facility, left the darkroom, except this airman second class and myself. And we're in waiting for someone to come to remove this piece of equipment. And at the time, I didn't know what the real purpose of this darkroom and this operation in this facility was. I thought this was where they were bringing the data in and then releasing the images to the public. They were doing 35 millimeter strips of film at that time, which were then assembled into 18.5 by 11 inch mosaics, they were called. There was a digital signature and a grayscale on every 35 millimeter strip. And those strips were from successive passes around the moon. So he was showing me how all this worked, and we walked over to one side of the lab, and he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And I said, whose? What do you mean, whose? He said, yes, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And at that point, I became frightened, and I was a little terrified, thinking to myself that if anybody walks in the room now, I know we're in jeopardy, we're in trouble, because he shouldn't be giving me this information. And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings, there were very tall towers, and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. If I compare it to what I'm seeing now, because I do have photographs that have artifacts in them that are similar to what I saw, they're massive. Some of the structures are, you know, half a mile in size. So they're huge structures. Some of the buildings seem to have very reflective surfaces on them. A couple of structures that I saw reminded me of cooling towers at power generating plants. They had that sort of a shape. Some of them were just very, very straight and tall with a flat top. Some of them were round. Some of them looked like a Quonset hut, with a domed kind of, like a greenhouse. The particular shot that I saw, there were several clustered together over a landscape, a fairly large landscape. I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy. Do you understand what I'm saying? I would love to have looked at it longer. I would have loved to have had copies. I would love to have, said more about it or discussed it more, but I knew I couldn't. And I knew that young fellow who was sharing this was really, really overstepping his bounds at that point.
They said, we were going to show you a film that might help you best put into perspective what you gentlemen have witnessed and help you maybe put it to bed a little bit for yourselves. This thing went all the way up to the space program. It showed, and I swear to God, it showed structures on the moon, these box kind of things that looked sand colored. It showed that lunar car moving around. I remember those clearly because I remember being a child when all that was happening, but them at a distance pointing, astronauts pointing at these box-looking things, structured objects moving off the surface of the moon, filmed by definite Apollo missions.
Donna Hare is a former NASA employee at Johnson Space Center, a technician, who was present at a facility where she inadvertently was shown an aerial photograph of a UFO casting a shadow upon the ground. She confirms that the man who showed her this photograph told her that it was to be airbrushed out before released from this secret facility at NASA. She also later found that there were a number of such photographs and other evidence which NASA had, and which were routinely sanitized or eliminated before being shown outside of these compartmented operations.
This day, that particular day, I walked into the photo lab in the restricted area, and this was between missions. One of the gentlemen I had been friends with, and I still talk to occasionally, he pointed my attention to one area of this mosaic. It was one panel of a mosaic, and I said, this is really interesting. He explained everything, and then he, with a smile on his face, he said, look over there. And I looked, and in one of the photo panels, I saw a round white dot. And at the time, it was very crisp, very sharp lines on it. And I said to him, what is that? Is that a dot on the emulsion? And then he's grinning and he says, dots on the emulsion don't leave round shadows on the ground. And there was a round shadow at the right angle, at the correct angle, the sun shining on the trees. I saw pine trees. I didn't see a coastline. I don't know where this was. But I looked at him and I was pretty startled because I'd worked out there several years and never seen anything like this, never heard of anything like this. And I said, is this a UFO? And he's smiling at me and he says, I can't tell you that. I can't tell you that. What I knew he meant was it was, but he couldn't tell me. So I said, what are you going to do with this information? And he said, well, we always have to airbrush them out before we sell them to the public. And I was just amazed that they had a protocol in place for getting rid of UFO pictures. I asked guards, security guards. I ran into another security guard that was forced to burn a lot of UFO pictures. And he told me, he came into my office one day. This was when I worked at another job. He came into my office and he was very frightened. And he said, Donna, I heard you were interested in this subject. He said, I used to work out there. And one day, some soldiers came in the fatigues and had me burn pictures. And he said that he was burning them. I mean, he was forced not to look at them. But he was tempted. He looked at one of them, and it was a UFO on the ground. Shortly thereafter, he was hit in the head with a gun butt, and he still had a scar on his forehead from that being knocked out because he looked at the picture.
And we get quite a bit of information about the sightings. We get drawings of what the vehicles look like, whether they landed or not, whether they saw any people with them, you know, extraterrestrials, things like that. And we would get pictures in of the supposedly AVM or satellite areas that picked up on the Soviets, what they were building sites. And once in a while, an anomaly would show up on the picture that didn't belong there. A round object, a triangular object. They were not markings put on the photograph that indicate some place or anything like that. These were above ground. They were not part of the picture itself.
Yes, there have been ET visitation. There have been crashed craft. There have been material and bodies recovered. And there is some group of people somewhere that may or may not be associated with government at this point, but certainly were at one time, that have this knowledge and have been attempting to conceal this knowledge or not permit it to be widely disseminated. The question of has it been kept secret or how could it be kept secret? It hasn't been kept secret. It's been there all along, but it has been the subject of disinformation in order to deflect attention and to create confusion so that the truth doesn't come out. Disinformation is simply another method of stonewalling, and that's been used consistently for the last 50 years or so.
Nick Pope is a Ministry of Defense official, still currently employed at the Ministry of Defense, who headed up the Ministry of Defense's UFO office for investigating this phenomenon for a number of years in the 1990s. I met Mr. Pope when he was still working in that capacity back in 1993. In his testimony, you will learn of incontrovertible evidence of events of massive objects moving at extraordinary speeds on radar, which are not manufactured on this earth. He will also confirm the Bentwaters case and other extraordinary cases within the United Kingdom and the existence of extensive government files related thereto.
I received somewhere between 200 and 300 UFO reports each year, and my job was to evaluate these to come to a decision about whether there was evidence of any threat to the defense of the United Kingdom. We were left with a hard core of sightings which defied any conventional explanation whatsoever, and these were a bunch of interesting cases involving sightings by military personnel, near misses between UFOs and aircraft, instances where UFOs were tracked on radar, and cases where UFOs were captured on film and video. One of the most significant waves of sighting in Europe took place over Belgium in March of 1990, and on that occasion UFOs were seen by large numbers of people on the ground and tracked on radar, resulting in 2 F-16 fighter interceptors being scrambled. These aircraft then picked up the UFO themselves on their airborne radar, and an intriguing game of cat and mouse played itself out in the skies of Belgium over the next hour or so. On the 30th and 31st of March 1993, a series of UFO encounters took place over Great Britain, the most interesting of which involved an occasion where 2 Air Force bases were actually overflown by a large triangular or diamond-shaped UFO. Now, the 2 establishments involved in this are RAF Cosford and RAF Shawbury. One important fact about the British wave of sightings in March 1993 was that it happened 3 years to the very night after the wave of sightings that rocked the establishment in Belgium and led to the scrambling of F-16s. That, again, was late on the 30th and in the early hours of the 31st of March. I've made no secret of the fact that I believe some of these UFOs may well be of extraterrestrial origin. Now, I know that that's an extraordinary statement for a serving officer in the Ministry of Defence to make, but it is me speaking on the basis of 3 years official research and investigation. So I don't make these statements lightly, and I don't do so on the basis of a blind leap of faith. I do it on the basis of the data held by the government.
Now, during this next section of the videotape, you will hear from people who have been involved in events where objects of extraterrestrial origin have landed or have crashed or been forced down and which have been retrieved. This is, of course, explosive testimony. It establishes the reality of the phenomenon and also of the fact that we have been studying this phenomenon for years. Many people will think that this is limited to the so-called Roswell event of the 1940s. This could not be further from the truth. In fact, there have been multiple events, at least a couple of dozen events, where objects of extraterrestrial origin have been acquired, have been retrieved, and which have been studied. We think that this is something which is of extreme importance because you cannot consider that covert programs, having spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the decades on research and development, so-called reverse engineering or back engineering of extraterrestrial technologies, have not had significant breakthroughs. The testimony will show that in fact we have had breakthroughs which have trickled out to our society in the form of certain advances in electronics. However, the central breakthrough dealing with the physics of the quantum vacuum space, the so-called zero-point energy phenomenon, as well as the anti-gravity electrogravitic phenomenon, that these technologies have been withheld from our society. Brigadier General Stephen Lubkin is a practicing attorney in North Carolina and a brigadier general in the Army National Guard with the JAG Division. He, as a young man, was assigned to the White House during Eisenhower's period, and also at the Pentagon saw some of the material from the crash of an extraterrestrial vehicle in New Mexico. He also speaks about Eisenhower's knowledge of the subject and his great concern about the fact that there were projects and activities about which he apparently was not being informed.
We were in the basement of the Pentagon, and in those days, that was in 1959, there was a tremendous amount of security there in the basement of the Pentagon. Anybody who's worked there knows what I'm talking about. I learned a lot about Project Blue Book. Blue Book was discussed quite openly in the office. Sections of Blue Book were opened for discussion, and then there were other matters as well that were brought to our attention one afternoon when we were just about ready to finish up training. It was about 3:30, maybe 3:45 in the afternoon. Colonel Hollibird brought out a piece of what appeared to be metallic. It was a metallic piece of looked like a yardstick. It had deciphering. It had encryption on it. He did describe them as being symbols of instruction, and that's as far as he would go. But he did infer that the instructions, whatever they might have been, were something that was important enough for the military to keep working on a constant basis. It seemed giant-like when I saw it because it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this before, and all eyes were just peeled on that particular thing. And when he told us what it was, it was frightening. It was eerie there. You could have heard a pin drop in the room when it was first mentioned. Well, he said it had been taken from one of the craft that had crashed in New Mexico, and that it had been taken from a box of materials that the military was working on. They didn't use the word reverse engineering at that time, but it was something similar to the reverse engineering that they felt like they needed to work on, and it was going to take years to do this. Extraterrestrial bodies, yes. There were either 3 or 5, and they didn't even know at that point, because some of the information that they had gotten apparently was incomplete. But 3 or 5 stands out in my mind as the number that were taken. One was alive, partially alive at the time that this happened, and I do not know what may have happened to him after that. The findings that were put in there were highly scientific, and they were highly gone over by the people that knew what they wanted to put in there. This information was information that would never get out to to anyone else, but it was designed for the use of particular military personnel. There were probably 1,500 reported cases at that time. I would say there probably were between 200 and 300 cases of lock-on. And that's why those cases were in there, because they were authentic. You saw an awful lot. You saw a lot of the pictures. Most of the pictures we have seen duplicates of today. Some were, the pictures that I saw were, I think, maybe a little bit better. They were taken by Air Force pilots, as well of the UFOs. Yes.
So they actually had pictures of UFOs in these.
Oh, indeed they did. Yes, not only the Air Force, but some were taken by civilian pilots. Some were taken by Marine Air Corps pilots, and some were foreign. The whole process of dealing with the UFO phenomenon could not be handled anymore by one agency, and so in order to keep it alive, and I guess as cheaply as possible, it was given to various and sundry parts of the government to work on, and I guess they thought that they could also keep the intelligence factor as secret as possible by giving little agencies a little bit here and a little bit there, and that oftentimes is done with matters like this. But what happened was Eisenhower got sold out. I think that he realized that all of a sudden this matter is going into the control of corporations. He realized that he was losing control. He realized that the phenomenon of whatever it was that we were faced with was not going to be in the best hands, and those were as far as I can remember, that was the expression that was used. It's not going to be in the best hands.
Harlan Bentley was with the United States Army in Maryland when one of these objects came in and crashed very near the facility where he was working one evening in the 1950s. In addition, on subsequent nights, these objects were tracked on radar and were tracked moving in extraordinary ways. Later, while working in a sensitive intelligence capacity, he was at a facility in California, which he prefers not to name, monitoring the transmissions from one of our Apollo moon missions. And in this transmission, he heard and has testified that the astronauts encountered some sort of UFO or object in space en route to the moon.
In 1957 to 59, I was mostly outside of Albany, Maryland, just north of Washington, D.C., at a Nike Ajax missile facility. I was a radar operator. In May of 1958, about 6 a.m., and the reason I knew it was 6 is because that's when everybody got up. I looked out the window. At first I heard a sound. It sounded like a pulsating transformer. I looked out the window and looked across the field and saw this object heading towards the ground and saw it crash. It broke apart, and then it took off again in flight. It was probably in excess of 30 feet in diameter. It had circular balls appeared on the outer rim up close to a cake-like fixture on top. And they were different colors. They were orange and red and some yellow, but they were pulsating. So I mean, it was quite a sight to see as it was wobbling towards the earth and hit. And it came in at a fairly rapid rate. The other issue there was that when the craft took off again after it crashed, it went through a grove of trees, which it actually sheared 3, 4, 5-inch limbs in just one fell swoop, like a knife or a machete. The largest piece that I saw, which was actually glowing white hot, was probably the size of a washing machine. Shortly thereafter, the Air Force personnel had arrived going across this field and started picking up these pieces. Now they used long poles, very long poles, to pick up the biggest piece, and they proceeded to put it on a truck that was lead-lined truck and pushed it in with another long pole and got it inside the truck itself. Then the other personnel picked up the other pieces that were laying about. The real exciting part happened the next evening while I was on duty, and it was approximately 10, 11 at night. And I got a call from the Gaithersburg facility saying that they had 12 to 15 UFOs 50 to 100 feet off the ground. So I asked the guy who was on the radio with me, I said, what do they sound like? He took his head mic off, put it out the van window, and again, the pulsating sound, except there were more of them. I had the radar on, the M33 radar, sweep radar, and I found right next to the ground clutter where Gaithersburg sits, I found the blip where these vehicles were. And then all of a sudden they all took off at the same time. And from my radar scope, it went one sweep. It's a 33 1/3 RPM. To go that distance from the center out to where I got the next blip in the first sweep at a constant velocity would have to be 17,000 miles an hour, which we calculated from our analog computer. I was at a facility in California, that's all I can say, and I was doing particular classified work, set aside from what was actually happening there. It was a completely different scenario. The only thing I can say is it was occurring at the same time that our astronauts were doing a loop around the moon and back again. On their trip to that moon, or to the moon itself, I heard the expression of the bogey coming in at 11 o'clock. Well, familiar with that particular term, I perked my ears and started listening a little bit and discovered that Houston and the astronauts were talking back and forth about a collision. And the astronauts asked for permission to do avoidance for a collision, and Houston finally granted that permission to do that. And after the After the comm links settled down a little bit, the astronaut said, it's not necessary. They are now paralleling our course. And there was a discussion as to what was paralleling that course. There was another type of ship. There were portals there that they could see in. They could see beings of some sort. They did not describe these beings. They just took photographs. And after a while, a few thousand miles, and then they took off from the capsule that they were flying in and went away.
Colonel Philip Corso, now deceased, is known by many people for his expose of the events surrounding the Roswell event. We include some of his testimony here because not only his role, but his information is corroborated by other witnesses who were present either at that event or at subsequent events involving the retrieval of extraterrestrial vehicles or extraterrestrial biological entities. He served as a staff member of Eisenhower's National Security Council. No one has been able to contradict his testimony or the essential fact that he dealt directly with the technological reverse engineering projects and transfer of technologies from the study of these extraterrestrial debris.
I was a duty officer that night. And I went to the veterinarian section, and one of a sergeant I knew very well was sergeant of the guard that night. I told him, Sarge, how's everything around here? And he said, fine, sir. I told him, you know, they told me to be careful to watch this area because you have a sense of something sensitive here. He said, you want to see it, sir? I told him, yes, let's go look. And I knew this sergeant, he was a master sergeant. I went back, and there was 5 crates there, like 5 or 6, I think it was 5. I lifted one up, and here's this body there and floating in fluid. First I thought it was a child because it was small. Then I looked at this head and all, right away, and this was only happened in a matter of seconds. Then I put the end back down, and the head was different, the arms were spindly, the body it was gray. So right at that moment I figured, I don't know what this thing is. So like in intelligence business, I just better put it in the back of my head here and wait till maybe in the future I get corroboration so I can evaluate what it is. And I told him, where did it come from, Sarge? He said, well, 5 trucks are coming through here from an airfield in New Mexico, and they're heading for Wright-Patterson Air Force. There I started getting the topsy reports. I started getting other crash reports, the artifacts I got. And I did get one time a report that NSA was getting signals from space, which were not just space noise or or unscrambled or something you couldn't read. They were really very perfect and looked like something was guiding them. There was a real message, but we were never able to decode it. This was a very coordinated message. It wasn't space noise or jam or jumble mumble or anything like that, or just noise coming. It was a pattern. When we gave the information out, we gave it out and insisted they take the patents. But also we put a little bit of a requirement on there. Requirement, feed it back to us for the competitive edge of the Army. Take the patents, make all the money you want, but give it to the American people and give it to the world. The Japanese, they interviewed me, and I told them when we put the integrated circuit out, we also gave it to you.
He made a comment that was really funny at that particular point. I didn't really connect it with anything until later. He says, you have no idea at all what we're about, do you? And I told him, no, sir, I don't. He says, well, someday the technology will be out there that has been totally back-engineered. Went right over my head at that particular point.
There's a lot of this has been well documented by Colonel Corso. You know, who was there with him? Well, there were a lot of people there with him. But a lot of the things that are said in the book or documented in the book by the How for Corso, I can verify, corroborated by the people that I have worked with and do work with now.
I read Colonel Corso's book the day after Roswell. In the book, he said a lot of fantastic things. And he also said near the end of the book that there was a base on the backside of the moon. And when he said that, I said, aha. So I began to believe that everything he was saying was true. And he was saying a lot of really profound things about the crash in Roswell and alien technology and whatever, and how it had been mainstreamed through the Office of Foreign Technology by himself. So I knew that he was probably telling the truth.
He also had fiber optics laying there. They didn't know what these things were. They figured they were wires of some sort, but didn't know how they operate. The interesting thing that shows you that we have not achieved a point of where these fiber optics are is my dad would also hold them in his hand, and when he closed his hand around them, the ends would be glowing. So this means they contain their own energy.
Okay, well, why would you need a fiber optic system in a spaceship? Well, okay, if suddenly everything in the vehicle suddenly becomes mass canceled, and even the electrons become mass canceled, it means that all of the telemetry that's going through your system is going to go out of haywire. It's going to be like suddenly the system goes through a phase change and everything's superconducting. Why use fiber optics? Because photons have no mass, supposedly. So they're unaffected. So it means that any information, any telemetry that you send back and forth to your computer, it doesn't matter if the computer functions at a superconducting level because it just makes it faster, more efficient, smarter. But you want to be able to control the aircraft so it doesn't crash. And what's the best way to do it with fiber optics?
The one person I happened to meet and took quite a shine to, and he to me, was a Dr. Adolf Raum. Just a little background on him. He was from Switzerland originally. He was on the first A-bomb test in the U.S. He knew Dr. Oppenheimer personally, and just a fine, fine gentleman. One night after supper and after a few martinis, I jokingly asked Adolf, I said, what do you know about the little gray men that are supposedly on ice here at Wright-Patterson? And I can distinctly recall his face turning ashen white. His voice got very stern, and he said, Arnie, he says, all I can tell you is that they were not weather balloons, and we will not talk about it again. You understand? And there was no uncertainty in my mind that we wouldn't talk about this further.
And then Curtis LeMay started to open up and talk about what he told me about Roswell and the crash that had occurred. And he told me that he was aware that it wasn't ours, it wasn't the military's, the Air Force or the Army or the Navy, and that was highly strange. Was a highly strange vehicle that crashed.
He said, I'm going to tell you something. He said, but if you say that I told you, I'll swear I never even mentioned it to you. I said, no problem. And he said to me, you know, I'm a member of General Douglas MacArthur's security guard. He says, I'm on my way to the States for TDY. He said, I'm going to tell you something. General Douglas MacArthur is very familiar with the Roswell incident, the crash material, and also the bodies, because he himself has seen them.
It just, my sincere feeling is that the thing was something from outer space, and we decided that, I say we, the military decided that our public may not accept it very graciously.
When I arrived at the base, where I usually back up to this ramp and unload the patients, there was 3 field Army Air Force ambulance backed up against the ramp. And so I had to swing around. But anyway, we were walking up the ramp and I saw a lot of debris. And so when I got in and checked him in, got all the vouchers and everything signed, I said, this captain there, and I said, sir, it looked like we had a crash. I need to get ready for it. And who in the hell are you and what are you doing here? And I said, well, I had an emergency and we have the contract for all military services. It looks like you had a crash. He just said, stay right here, don't move. And so I stayed there, and pretty soon he came back with 2 military police and said, get this guy off of the base, you're not supposed to be here.
We can safely say that, yes, there were some captured craft in Roswell, New Mexico, and yeah, they were real. And yes, we really did get some technology from them. And yes, we really did put it to work.
I think they made a mistake at Roswell. Rather than admitting it, they covered it.
John Wygant is a lance corporal in the Marines. He's a young man who was very frightened to come forward, but felt that he could not remain silent anymore. In 1997, he was stationed at a secret facility in Peru when one of these extraterrestrial vehicles was apparently targeted and hit. It crashed, and he was one of the first people on site to see the device and to describe it. He has come forward even though he has been severely threatened and intimidated.
One day, Sergeant Allen and the other sergeant, and I'll remember his name soon, Sergeant Atkins. They were, and Sergeant Montalegre, and they came to us and said, "Look, you know, we got a situation where we have an aircraft crash that's possibly friendly, and they need us to go and secure the crash site." And well, we found the area really easy because there was a huge gash in the land where something had crashed. Everything was burned, and it was like if you had almost cut like a warm butter with a knife. I mean, it was just, it's like something on fire or had or some kind of energy, like a laser almost had like gutted. I mean, it was really strange, and basically we were the first ones to see the object. And basically what happened is we didn't go straight up the hill, because basically this thing went up the hill and then off into the side of the ravine or the ridge. This is about a 200-foot ridge at least. It was buried in the side of the cliff. But anyway, we didn't go straight up. We went on to the left and walked up to the top of the ridge. And that's when we saw the craft. Basically, this is a huge ship, and 10 meters in width and about 20 meters in length. I'm just not sure. That's just an estimate from what I remember. But it was huge. I mean, it was big, man. And it was shaped like almost like between an egg and like a teardrop almost. And when I first saw it, you know, I was scared. It scared the heck out of me. You know, I didn't know what to do, and it was dripping this syrup-like syrup viscosity, this liquid. It was everywhere, all down everywhere when we went down there, because there was plants and everything. And it was weird. It was a purplish green color, and it kind of like fluctuated. Like you couldn't really, when you'd look at it one time, then you look at it again, and it would it's almost like it. I don't know if it was like alive and it was just changing, but every time you looked at it, you saw a different shade of greenish purple. It was strange. There was one light on it that slowly went around, and the machine, I could hear it. I could hear, I guess because it was still functioning, and it had like a hum to it, like a really bass, like say if you unplugged an amp from a guitar, that kind of, you know, it was really, you know, it was really deep, and it kind of fluctuated, and then finally it just cut off, and everything just seemed to stop. When I was looking at the craft, it was buried, so I could see the back of it, and there were these large vents. Well, they look like vents, sort of like a fish gill on the back. I couldn't see around the other side, and I'm assuming that it was the same way on the other side. That looked like, I don't know, that could have been used for propulsion. I'm not sure. You know, in Stinger School, they teach you about all different kinds of aircraft and stuff like that. And I knew a lot of aircraft anyway, because I like reading about aircraft and data and that stuff. And well, essentially, when I saw it, I'm like, man, this is nothing that I know of. because I had been in the command center there at the radar installation, and I heard a couple women there in the Air Force talking about aircraft flying in and out of the atmosphere at Mach 10 plus.
And that was happening.
Oh, this happened all the time. There's like 3 or 4 incidents where I was duty there that the same Air Force officer came in there to get books. The reason, I guess the reason they were taking them is they didn't want people to know that they're tracking these aircraft. I guess, I mean, again, I'm just assuming that.
Well, I was at Wright-Patterson, of course. I was approached by an individual that, and I'm not going to mention his name, to determine if I wanted to work in an area on just new creative things, okay? And apparently that was the flying disc simulator. What they had done, they had selected several of us, and they reassigned me to a Link Aviation, which was a simulator manufacturer. The simulator wasn't actually functional until around 1958, where the simulator was actually operable. Craft that they used to build, which is a 30-meter one, was the one that crashed in Arizona, Kingman, Arizona, back in 53 or 52. We operated with 6 large capacitors that were charged with 1 million volts each. Say there were 6 million volts in those capacitors. They're largest capacitors ever built. In a simulator now, you'll notice that there are no seat belts, right? And the same thing with the actual craft, no seat belts. You don't need seat belts, because when you fly one of these things upside down, there's no upside down like in a regular aircraft. You have your own gravitational field right inside. So if you're flying upside down, to you, you're right side up. We had a long period of introduction into meeting, you know, say an EVE, an alien. And I called him J-Rod. Of course, that's what they called him, but that wasn't his, you know, I don't know if that was his real name or not, but that's the name that the linguist gave him. He used to come in with Teller and some of the other guys occasionally on questions that maybe we'd have, you know. But you got to understand that everything was, you know, specific to the group. If it wasn't specific to the group, you couldn't talk about it.
Larry Warren was a security officer at Bentwaters Air Force Base in the United Kingdom. He is an American, and this was an American facility. He was present during the event in 1980 when an extraterrestrial vehicle landed, hovered, and interacted with Air Force personnel at Bentwaters. His testimony is corroborated by events that happened at the same facility by Lori Rayfield, whom you'll hear from later, as well as by multiple other military witnesses whom have been identified. There are official documents related to this event, there is a photograph related to the event, and there is physical landing trace evidence and reports. This entire event is also corroborated by another witness, Ministry of Defense official Nick Pope, as well as 5-star Admiral and Sea Lord and former Ministry of Defense head Lord Hill Norton.
We pulled up, there were some other vehicles. There was an armorer's vehicle. They took our weapons off us. Each weapon is assigned by number anyway, and it's with you for your whole assignment. And that was taken away from us. We broke up into 4-man units. We headed down a trail into the forest. Charles Halt was out there at that night with a smaller party of senior people. Lieutenant England joined them at one point. Came to a clearing called Capel Green at the end of the Corsican Pine. And there was a phenomena on the ground in this field. It was like a mist. It looked like a fog on the ground. I saw a light come in. We could see the beam of the Orford Lighthouse in this clearing, by the way, very clearly. This case has been written off as a misidentification of this lighthouse, an exaggeration or whatever. In reality, that was there for over 100 years and was no surprise to anyone. This object, a red basketball-shaped object, came in from the North Sea area over the trees. I thought it was a taillight on an aircraft. It moved so quickly that it came in over the trees. I go to this site all the time and I see it as clear as day. Did a downward arc over Capel Green, came to a point over this mist. Now, it's been misrepresented. There was a mist on the ground. It appeared to have structure. It was 50 foot across. This basketball-sized amber light, it didn't seem solid. I couldn't tell you what it was 20 feet above the object, this mist. There was an explosion. This is described. It's very hard for me to describe it. This thing broke up into multiple shards of extremely bright light. I and others suffered, and I have documents of this because I stole them from Bentwaters because an officer advised me to, because he said, your military record is going to vaporize as soon as you're gone. My eyes were damaged, flash burns to the retinas and all. This is established as if I stared an arc welder's torch for about 10 minutes, which is unadvisable. Everything was very bizarre at that point. In the place of this explosion of light, very silent, there was no sound, anything, was a structured solid object, rather large, probably 30 feet at the base, to a pyramid type shape, no windows, flags on it. It was very rough. It was distorted as you looked at it, with a rainbow-like effect, and yet through peripheral vision you could get a fix. I was at least 30 feet away from it at one point. Too close. This bright light moved out. It was bluish gold. It was about a foot off the ground. It split, and it was only about 4 feet in height from the ground up, but it split away, and 3 individual kind of oblong cocoons of light with this thing in it. These 3 individual things inside it, and these things had an upper body I clearly saw and when I saw an arm, what I perceived to be arms move, I'm like, you're in another place at that point. There's witnesses are coming out now saying, unbeknownst to us, there were 3 massive triangular objects over the base, over the forest, and over the Woodbridge base the whole time.
We thought it was just regular aircraft coming in, and we looked over at the runway, waiting for the lights to go on, figuring, well, the aircraft coming in, and then all of a sudden it just stops in midair, and then all of a sudden it just moves up, down, left, right, and then it breaks into like 3 pieces and speeds across the runway. And now we're stunned. We're like, what was that?
All these years later, from 1988 to 9, we have done core samples, soil analysis, many of this stuff analyzed by Springborn Environmental Labs in Massachusetts by accredited scientists, but it is phenomenal. Absolute phenomena took place only in that spot to a level of 3 feet down. Plants do not grow in this one spot, no matter what crop. We've talked to the farmers for 20 years. However, the soil is darker. It does not absorb water. There was evidence left by this encounter, pod indentations on the ground. Podcasts were made for the indentations. Charles Holt still has possession of one of them, and does show people this, and would show it to any congressional body, I think, when it comes to were there radar returns. On all nights in question, RAF Watton, on the 3rd night and the 1st night, picked up, their eastern radar, by the way, picked up an object over Rendlesham Forest descending into the forest.
Britain's most famous UFO case is the Rendlesham Forest incident, which is sometimes also referred to as the Bentwaters case. Now, all the witnesses to this are military personnel. They're trained observers. They don't make mistakes. Some of the skeptics have suggested that this could have been a mistaken sighting of a nearby lighthouse. That's nonsense for two reasons. Firstly, these were trained military observers who actually were familiar with the lighthouse and saw it pretty much every night of their tour of duty. But secondly, certainly at one point in the encounter, the lighthouse was clearly visible at the same time as the UFO. Now, one of the things that was done was that the area was checked for radiation, and this is where I came in. I took the readings that were taken, and it's important to say these readings peaked in two places. They peaked in the indentations themselves, and also some damage that was done to the sides of the trees in the clearing. I sent the data from Holt and his team to the Defence Radiological Protection Service, which is part of the Ministry of Defence. And they came back to me and they were frankly bemused by this whole thing, and they said that the radiations from the indentations in the ground were 10 times background for that area, 10 times what they should have been.
Bentwaters is another very interesting case. With Bentwaters, we went there to digest some of the information as far as the physical evidence there. There were photographs, there was film footage, there was evidence of high background radiation, or a higher than normal background radiation, not all that high, but above normal. We found that there was some abnormalities in the area of which we referred to the impact point. We also noticed that the trees had been leveled off at the top. As far as sightings, it was picked up on radar. Both the British government and the U.S. government were aware of these sightings. The hard evidence that we had was taken back to Lindsay Air Force Base, and that the material was transferred on to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, headquarters at the time of the U.S. Air Force's Special Field Activities Group.
I know a good bit about the Bentwaters incident, and I've read half a dozen books. I've interviewed a number of the people who took part in it. And what I have decided, after careful thought, and I have said it in public more than once before, there are only two explanations for what happened that night in Suffolk. The first is that what the people concerned, including Colonel Holt, who was at the time the deputy commander of the base, and a lot of his soldiers, or airmen, they claim that something from outside the Earth's atmosphere landed at their Air Force base. They went and stood by it, they inspected it, they photographed it. The following day they took tests on the ground where it had been and found radioactive traces. That is one explanation, that it actually happened, as Colonel Holt reported. The other explanation is that it didn't. And in that case, one is bound to assume that Colonel Holt and all his men were hallucinating. My position is perfectly clear. Either of those explanations is of the utmost defense interest. Surely, to any sensible person, either of those explanations must be, cannot fail to be, of defense interest. That the colonel of an American Air Force base in Suffolk and his merry men are hallucinating when there are nuclear-armed aircraft on the base must be of defense interest.
Major George Filer was an Air Force intelligence officer who not only had an extraordinary encounter with a massive UFO on radar over the United Kingdom, but later, in the 1970s, while he was at the McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, came in one morning to find that an extraterrestrial biological entity had been shot and killed at Fort Dix and had come over to adjacent McGuire Air Force Base, where it died and was on the tarmac. And he will testify that this life form was then picked up and taken back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
We were flying tankers over England, and London Control asked us to intercept a UFO. and we happened to be done with our refueling mission, and you know, we accepted the assignment. We were on the just over the North Sea, and they asked us to fly to the center of England, and we got about, I'm not exactly sure, 20-30 miles out, and I got it on radar, and it was a very large return. And obviously London Control had it on their radar, and they were vectoring us to this object. And when we got about a mile from it, as a matter of fact, we were diving on the thing, and the whole aircraft was shaking, and it just took off into space at several thousand miles an hour. And this particular morning, when I went into the command post, I was met by the head of the command post, and he said that it's been a very exciting evening, that we've had UFOs in the, you know, over the McGuire all night, and that one had apparently landed or possibly crashed at Fort Dix, and that when a military policeman came upon the alien, that he had pulled out a gun and shot them. And I said, you know, a foreigner, like, you know, an alien? I was a little bit confused by him saying alien. He says, no, an alien from outer space. He was very specific about the fact that an alien from outer space had been shot at Fort Dix, and that it had run away after being wounded and headed for McGuire. Now, McGuire and Fort Dix just have a fence between them, and this alien supposedly climbed the fence or went under it or whatever and got to McGuire and died out on the end of the runway. And the security police were out there and had captured the body, so to speak, and were guarding it. And he said that a C-141 from Wright-Patterson was coming in to pick up the plane. So I was like, you know, my gosh, what's going on here? He says, we want you to brief this at the, you know, stand-up general briefing this morning and explain what happened to everybody. And I was like, you want me to tell General Tom Sadler and everybody in the command post that, you know, we captured an alien? Almost every day I went to the photo lab, because in your briefings you have, well, 4 screens, and you have to keep them all, you know, filled up with pretty pictures and so on. And there they indicated that they had taken pictures of something extraordinary. And I said, well, let me see them. And the sergeant was handing it to me, and his master sergeant says he can't see those. So all I know is that they had some pictures that I wasn't allowed to see. But normally, being the general's briefer, I had never been, you know, stopped from seeing any pictures that they had previously. Now, one interesting thing is many of the key personnel on the base at that time who had a connection to this, with this, were quickly transferred from the wing commander on down.
Sergeant Clifford Stone has worked as a specialist within various divisions of Army operations dealing with the retrieval of extraterrestrial vehicles. He recounts how he has specifically seen extraterrestrial bodies and been involved in the retrieval of materiel from more than one extraterrestrial vehicle which has been downed or which has crashed. His testimony, again, is corroborated by others, such as Colonel Corso, regarding the fact that we have indeed retrieved extraterrestrial devices and studied them within our projects.
MacArthur organized what was called the Interplanetary Phenomena Research Unit. It would later be taken over by General Marshall, and it continued all the way through to present day. Names have been changed. Records still haven't surfaced. The Army tries to state that it was not an official organization effort to try to investigate UFOs, but it was organized by a general. It bore fruit. It came to conclusions that was not popular, i.e. interplanetary spacecraft. And they continued to do exactly what they do today, and that is to be part of a multi-intelligent operation in the recovery of objects of unknown origin, particularly those that are of non-earthly origin, and to assess that information, get raw field intelligence data, and process that data into some type of useful intelligence product to disseminate to the field to those people who have a need to know, and those people that are the, shall we say, the keepers of that information. In the 1950s, the United States Air Force had an elite unit to investigate UFOs outside of Blue Book, even though Blue Book thought that that unit was working with them, they were not. This unit was initially organized as the 4602nd Air Intelligence Service Squadron. Among its peacetime missions was Operation Blue Fly. Operation Blue Fly was to recover objects of unknown origin that fell to Earth. It's very important that you remember objects that fell to Earth because we didn't have any spacecraft up there at this time. Later it would be expanded in 1957 to cover all objects of unknown or all objects of unknown origin, and it would become part of what they would call in the 1957 October time frame Project Moondust. In short, under Moondust, under Blue Fly, we have recovered alien debris, not of this Earth. You have an airplane accident. We have standard procedures on how we handle that. Those same procedures are utilized when you do a recovery or extraction of a crashed spacecraft or debris thereof. And I have to stress debris simply because these are highly advanced technical machines. There were not that many crashes. They're flawable because they are made by an intelligence that is as mortal as you and I. Us being mortal, we are subject to error. Now, the way you package the material, if it's just debris, is handled the same way you would if it was hazardous material. You took precautions. If you had a whole craft, you took very serious precautions, because while I still state they are not hostile, but you could cause some serious accidents which would result in death. We were informed that there had only been a couple of dozen, tops. That there were several in the 40s, in the early 50s. And once again, to make it perfectly clear about those events that took place there, and I mean, it sounds crazy, but their guidance system, our radar wreaked havoc on. And they had to make adjustments to their guidance systems for that.
What happened was we found out that high power radar would interfere with their stability, because we could watch the amplifiers and stabilizers come down when it was low and slow, and radar affected them when it was low and slow.
How many bodies had been recovered? Don't know. How many crashes have occurred in which we only got debris from because they came and did their recovery before we got there? Don't know, but it has happened. It has happened. When they have problems, just like we send out a distress call, they send out a distress call, which is something that a lot of people don't allude to or don't even, it's the one question that's never asked. But here again, we think of them as something intangible, like that stuffed animal there. But they're living, breathing creatures, as mortal as you and I. They think, they have loves, they have likes, they have dislikes, they have social culture. This is so important to try to make people understand that that is the case.
This section of the briefing is regarding secrecy. How secrecy works. How have these projects worked? Some years ago, a military advisor of mine It explained to me something called an Unacknowledged Special Access Project, or USAP. This is a project which, while compartmented and which requires special access, is also unacknowledged. And what that means is that no one outside of that compartmented area of operation is told about it. And it doesn't matter if the person is the President of the United States, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I have, over the past 8 years, had the responsibility, unwelcome, I might add, on my part, of having to brief a sitting CIA director on this issue, a sitting head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, an admiral who headed up the J2 position, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as other senior people within the Congress, the Senate, the United Nations, and foreign governments. I have found that for the most part, these high officials have known nothing about these compartmented special access projects which are unacknowledged and which deal with this issue.
People in high-level government have very, very little, if any, information, valid information about this. Most have no more knowledge than the man in the street.
One area of the maintenance of these unacknowledged special access projects, which is very disconcerting, was highlighted by a 60 Minutes piece some years ago on CBS News, where it talked about a company called E-Systems, and the manner in which E-Systems was sort of a hybrid entity, which was quasi-governmental and quasi-private corporate. We have found that that is a motif which is repeated over and over again throughout the last 50 years, that certain projects have been compartmented within the corporate work for other sector, the contracting sector, and that those projects are related to deep cover, unacknowledged projects within the military and the intelligence community.
Well, I opened up the files, and all there was is form letters, maybe 2 or 3. And yet these contracts were several years old. And even the letters that were in there were backdated several years, saying the same exact form letter. It's being worked on, blah, blah, blah. And it was talking about millions of, sometimes millions of dollars. And all of them were 6 figures and up. Really? I thought they were getting a lot of money for doing nothing, and I didn't know where that money was going. It's like a friend for something. I mean, if it wasn't such a big complex and evidently well known, which I found out, as I worked there, I would have been very suspicious of what was going on. I wasn't there long. One of the supervisors caused a situation that was completely uncomfortable for me to stay there shortly thereafter, and I left. I was sexual harassment, but he had never bothered me before this.
Depending on the level of the compartmentalization and the secrecy level, you have to go through a fairly significant background check. It takes between 6 months to a year to get the background checks. And then when you do that, then you generally, if you're in a very tight compartment, then you have to sign a statement that you will not divulge the existence of the project or even answer a question that could divulge the existence of the project. And it's not even on a need-to-know basis. It's on a basis of people being identified specifically to know what you're working on and directly associated with the project. If you have a covert project, the funding would come through a number of government sources, none of which would be identified to the workers. It's just that you sign a contract with the U.S. government and the funding would show up at the right place at the right time. There's a large number of covert projects that go on in the United States that none of us are ever aware of. I mean, I know people today that worked on one of the things that I worked on, that if you asked them, do you recognize this name, they would, even if I can show it to you on the internet, there's some things that have come up recently on the internet where some of the stuff that I was associated with, their names are now on the internet. They would say, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. In their 70s now. But they still absolutely would never admit that they even know what you're talking about. So you don't know. You have no idea. But it's probably larger than you think.
Somewhere along the line, they may see that material and realize there's some very highly sensitive information that would have damning effect upon the national security of the United States should it become compromised. It requires to be further protected, to ensure that there is only a limited access to that information to a small number of people. So small you can put them on a list of paper or on a piece of paper and list them by name. Thus you have the special access programs. The controls that were supposed to be put on the special access programs are not there. When it comes to UFOs, the same criteria applies. The problem we have right now is that event, i.e. in the ultimate contact, where there is no longer a question about the reality of other beings in the universe coming here, that event has not taken place. Therefore, but a small nucleus within the intelligence community, numbering less than 100, and I'd suggest less than 50, control all that information. It is not subject to congressional review by the Information Security Oversight at all. We have got to get the documentation as it exists in the government files. We have got to get it released before it ultimately comes up being destroyed. As soon as we open a door, and we're right there, we're about to bust open the door. Good case is the Blue Book file, or the Blue Fly and Moondust files. I had classified documents. The Air Force acknowledged. When I got members of Congress to help me, they were immediately destroyed, and I can prove this. During the discussion of UFOs, the question ultimately is going to come up, can any government keep secrets, let alone the U.S. government? And the answer to that is unequivocally yes. But one of the greatest weapons the intelligence community has at their disposal is a predisposition by the American people, the American politicians, and I hate to call them debunkers, but we'll call them debunkers, people who wish to try to debunk UFO information. They immediately come out, oh, we can't keep secrets, we can't keep secrets. Well, the whole situation is, yes, we can. I am prepared to state that I have been at locations where craft of unknown origin that did not originate on the face of this planet was there. I am prepared to state that while I was there, we saw living, dead bodies of entities that were not born on this planet. I am prepared to state that we had what they referred to as interfacing with those entities. I am prepared to state that the situation is they have a school to try to indoctrinate people. I never went to that school. I always refused. I am prepared to state that when I got out of the service in 1990, that they held me for 2 months, that I might better reconsider to stay in and not get out. That they revoked those orders, once again in violation of law, to hold me for 2 months pending approval of my retirement, which had already been approved. The purpose of that was to try to convince me to stay in. We have contact with aliens not originating from some foreign country, but from some other solar system. And I have been a party to that.
There's always been what they call the need to know. And even myself, I had a top secret crypto clearance. And I could go into areas where my commanders, some commanders could not even get involved with. They can't get in there because they don't have the need to know, even though they have the same clearance as the guy that gets to go in there. So
the UFO secrets can be kept secret from other people who have the same security clearance or the same level of security?
A government is widespread, as everybody knows. I mean, it's into everybody's pockets and everybody's life all over the place, and the same thing holds true for the UFO extraterrestrial, if you want to look at it that way. But very, very few people really know the full knowledge of what's going on. It's held very tightly within black covert operations. They keep pretty much each organization an island unto itself. You don't have cross departmentalization a lot within the programs. TRW, Johnson Controls, Honeywell, all of them at some point or another became involved with the intelligence field. Certain works, some of Phil Corso's early back engineering projects. If you will look into those, Atlantic Research was one of them, way back. Entities that were created out of people in the Pentagon to become a quote-unquote Beltway bandit. Received projects, grants, and monies to do certain projects that were so highly classified, even though, you know, there was only a top secret, but so compartmentalized that, you know, only about 4 people would know what was going on. But as far as UFO and intelligence and extraterrestrial goes, it's right at the top. And I would say that the president has such limited knowledge of it. I know Carter did not have any knowledge whatsoever. And I worked right there with the organization, President Carter's organization. And the truth is, they have hidden things like UFO and extraterrestrial information from us for years. Not just the current era, but back before the 1900s.
Dan Salter is a retired Air Force career man, E9 Master Sergeant, who was involved in the extraterrestrial issue for many, many years. He later, after leaving the Air Force, was recruited into the super secret National Reconnaissance Organization, or NRO, during which time he worked specifically on extraterrestrial matters and the retrieval of extraterrestrial vehicles and the management of this subject. He had a cosmic top secret clearance, top secret cosmic compartmentalization, which he states no U.S. president, to his knowledge, has ever held.
There's about 38 levels above top secret. The highest is cosmic. That's, okay, I'll tell you right now, that's UFOs, aliens, and particleization. Now, like you heard a while ago, there's only probably about 25 people in the world that know things that are known at that level. No president has had that level, has ever been cleared for that level. Eisenhower was the closest. One that did not exist, it was so secret, was the NRO. You couldn't mention NRO, the National Reconnaissance Organization.
NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, basically run by the Air Force. The Reconnaissance Office, from my understanding of people that I've had contacts with since I retired, has taken on a lot more responsibility, particularly towards UFO and extraterrestrial activities. Almost you could say that they picked up where Blue Book dropped off.
Eisenhower wanted somebody to be in charge. He tried the CIA director, and it didn't work. CIA was working primarily for itself. most of the intelligence directors of the services working for themselves. So he said, I want it to be independent. I want it to be civilian. I want it to be some of our top scientists. And so it was organized under the name, the NIRO. If you're on that level, there's an organization worldwide called ACIO. That's Alien Contact Intelligence Organization. If you pay your dues and you follow the rules, you can benefit, your government is allowed to benefit from that organization's information. But we've been successful. We crashed in White Sands, New Mexico. We tracked it. We were tracking it at the time, and we were successful in damaging enough where it crashed. And yes, there were some aliens on it. Yes, we got them.
This next witness we only call by the initials AH. He is filmed from the back because he does not wish to be identified yet. He specifically talked with Curtis LeMay about the crash in New Mexico of one of these extraterrestrial vehicles prior to Curtis LeMay's death. General LeMay confirmed the existence of this extraterrestrial vehicle. He is also, as a Boeing aerospace employee, connected to a number of intelligence and aerospace figures who have deep knowledge of this subject. This is the only witness who will be presented here who is not identified. But it is important that his testimony be taken seriously because he confirms many of the accounts that we have from other corroborating sources, and his own bona fides, which I have seen, are substantial.
And I asked Curtis LeMay, and I said, Kurt, and I said, when you were in the Air Force, out of the 100% of sightings that came into the Air Force, how many of them were not identified? And he said, out of the 100% that came in, only 35% of them could not be identified. And I asked him, well, why couldn't they have been identified? And he said, because the craft are too damn fast. We can't catch them. And then I asked him about the Roswell crash, if that really occurred. And he looked over at me and he shook his head, yes, that it did occur. And he told me that he was aware that it wasn't ours, it wasn't the military's, the Air Force or the Army or the Navy, and it was highly strange. Was a highly strange vehicle that crashed. And I said I was particularly interested in the strange writings that were found inside. And I said, were they ever deciphered? And he said, far as he understood, they were not deciphered. There were more crashes than Roswell. What people don't understand is that there was one in 1948, and there was another one in 1949. The radar testing in New Mexico was the cause of a lot of them that were crashing, and high-powered transmitters, when they would get too close to transmitters, it would interfere with their guidance control, and they would just crash. And other craft that crashed, we had shot them down. I've met a gentleman that was in the Army, in the CID, that was involved with several crash recoveries when he was in the CID. And apparently he saw some of the aliens and witnessed the craft. One of the military officers said, he goes, gentlemen, we're not here on a Hollywood movie set. This is a highly classified mission. You're not even supposed to talk to your family about this. And they had to sign security oath statements that they would not talk about this for 50 years. Later on at Area 51 in the late 1960s, all crash debris and technology and anything that had to do with the alien-connected phenomenon all went to Area 51. Most of the major defense contractors have something to do with Area 51. Lockheed Martin, Boeing aircraft, they do trucking for Area 51, Boeing aircraft, Hughes, we're incorporating this technology from these craft that Area 51. And I also found out that they are moving a lot of the personnel and some of the equipment and some of the extraterrestrial technology equipment and the craft to base up in Utah. And they just try to sweep it right under the rug. And this is what Robert Friend told me, that the whole project was to get as much information and technology out of these crafts as fast as they could, and to steer the news media off on some crazy idea that these sightings were created by college pranks and balloons and meteorological problems. And a lot of the information was siphoned off by the CIA and the National Security Agency and people at ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence. Project Red Light is a program to test these vehicles and extract as much information as possible from the alien connected projects to find out how these things operate and gain as much information to possibly use this for our advancement, for our, like I said, for our fighters and bombers, and for our space connected projects. Well, through my NSA contact, he was in the Army. The NSA is a part of the Army. He was in advanced intelligence gathering. He had a top secret Umber clearance. He had told me that the NSA is fully aware of the extraterrestrial presence, and he had received several transmissions from the Pentagon and from other satellite monitoring stations of the NSA that they were tracking ETVs, extraterrestrial. That stands for extraterrestrial vehicles. Basically, that's the information that the NSA is refusing to release regarding the tracking. And they also cooperate back and forth with the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Organization, regarding tracking and intercepts, along with NORAD, the Air Force, and the Army. They're all in on it, and it's all connected with a top secret group called Magi Control. Magi Control is controlled by Office of Naval Intelligence. It's a top secret collection group like the Central Intelligence Agency and the NSA. In fact, the ONI is just like the CIA. It's a top secret organization within the Navy out of ONI to collect top secret information, collect information on foreign dignitaries, foreign leaders, the Alien Connected Project primarily. And Henry Kissinger headed some sort of a study group back in the 50s to study the ramifications of this information if it had leaked through a credible source. In fact, Jimmy Carter was not brought into the loop. They, for some reason, the group, the control group, they don't trust the guy for some reason. They don't trust Jimmy Carter. They were afraid that he would come out and make statements, blanketed statements to the news media. Basically, it was controlled by Majestic 12 people, the notorious MJ-12, which is no longer called MJ-12. I'm trying to find out the new name. Basically, it's an oversight group intermingled with the National Security Council and the National Security Planning Group. They have full control. They have no congressional oversight whatsoever. They answer to nobody except for the President of the United States. But they're trying to push it aside away from the President.
He was a a civilian, but had done a lot of work with NASA on a lot of committees and what have you. And I think his problem was the fact that he hadn't heard about this as being a real subject. And he knew that he was very important because he was on a lot of committees in NASA. And since he was very important but hadn't heard about this thing, this couldn't be true. And then he said a very curious thing. I wouldn't believe it even if it was real. This is a direct quote from his email to me. I would not believe this even if it was real. I've talked to a number of people who've studied this issue and feel that the, quote, cover-up of this issue that has been going on for the last 50 years is probably the biggest single threat to our democratic society it has ever faced since the Constitution was founded and this country was founded in 1776. We are at a major crossroads in how our society and our democratic society and government function, because this topic is not under control of our elected government, is not under control of our judicial government. It is under control of others.
The fact that the government, at this point, I know we've been investigating since 1947, has not come up with an answer, to me, indicates that there's something seriously wrong. Are we this incompetent in science? I don't think so. Are we this incompetent in intelligence? I know we're not this incompetent in intelligence. Now, the image put out, Project Blue Book, when it was closed by Dr. Condon's group, I have every reason to believe that this was a total deliberate whitewash. My judgment is that there's an excellent chance that elements of the United States government, for reasons unknown, have failed to advise the public.
After this happened in Oregon, and I came home on leave and told my dad about it. He was red, white, and blue through and through, World War II hero and all this, and very patriotic. And I was explaining to him about these UFOs that we've routinely seen out there. And he said, no, he says, the government says there are no UFOs. And I'm saying, Dad, I've seen these, on radar with my own eyes. And so he was torn. The government would never lie to him. Here's his son. I've never lied to him. So he just didn't know what to do. And it wasn't until years later, till after Watergate, that he said, hey, sit down and tell me about this. The government's lying to me.
Well, if they were hostile, my own knowledge is, and feeling, I don't know about all of them, is that we could have been, with their weaponry as it might be used, it could have destroyed us a long time ago.
The ballistic missile defense system is probably a pipe dream in the sense that if what it's designed for is that you know where it's coming from. And when we had Russia, there was a 50-50 chance that you knew about where it would be coming from. With the rogue nations we have today, it's absolutely ludicrous. In the 50s, they built a nuclear warhead that fit inside a Sparrow, AIM-7 Sparrow, which has an 8-inch diameter body. And that was a quarter-kiloton weapon. That'll fit inside any briefcase you can think of. Now, the guy may die carrying it, but he's going to die anyway, so what difference does it make? I'm far more afraid of that than if beings can travel in time-space, then anything we would put in orbit as a weapon would be like going against Genghis Khan with a firecracker.
Weapons in space is still a big enigma. Black covert operations have always been trying to do something like that. When Star Wars was brought out as an idea, which was before Reagan actually, and incorporated into his administration. It became pretty much a window dressing, as one people would call it, but there was a lot of truth behind what they were trying to do. They knew the basic principle of what they wanted to do. They wanted a weapon system they could put in space that would stop a ballistic missile. That was the concept. Now, if that ballistic missile happened to be coming from another direction other than earthbound, could it do the same thing? Or was it a ballistic missile? You know, concepts were there. Ideas were there.
I have concluded that I'm fighting against the clock, that I have but a short time to try to convince people that we are moving in an avenue where we are going to militarize space. As a result of militarizing space, we are going to acquire new technology. We're going to evolve new technology that's going to lead us into interstellar travel. As a direct result, we will become a threat to them unless we spiritually grow also.
We put nuclear weapons out in space as a line of defense, and we was ready to blow them up if they started in.
I noticed the satellite's positionings. I said, now this is supposed to be a system that tracks radar anomalies on Earth, right? You know, the whole thing, the movement. Yep, that's what it does. And I said, so why are half of them pointed towards the outer space? Towards the moon, towards areas that are just blank space? Well, I don't know, was the reply. He says, never thought about it. I says, well, at least half of those satellites you got up there aren't looking at Earth. I said, what are they looking for? He says, well, you got to have need to know about that. I said, I see. In other words, who's coming? He says, we don't know. Dropped, end of subject. There was a fear then that of something out there. It became a very big concern. Asteroids, UFOs, people coming from other places. Paranoia was also there within the government. You know, at certain levels, you could feel it. You knew it was happening. Would they tell the truth about it? I doubt it.
So when I hear that there's a possible threat of extraterrestrials, and I look at the history of thousands of years of possible visitations, recorded history, and when I hear now the stories of the disclosures of honest military intelligence industry people who have had experiences with UFOs, with crashes and landings, with live or dead bodies of extraterrestrial beings, people from out in the universes. And if I'm ever told that these are enemies against whom we have to build space-based weapon systems, based on my own personal experience of having worked in the military-industrial complex on weapon systems and military strategy, I'm going to know it's a lie.
We know that these unacknowledged special access projects have used intimidation, have used threats, and at times people have been killed to maintain this secrecy. I know that this is an extreme statement to make, but I am convinced from talking to not one, but dozens of military and intelligence men and women that this type of intimidation and threatening behavior has happened and continues to happen. I think this is something which is unacceptable in a democracy and in our society. Alfred Weber is a Yale Law School graduate who, while working for Stanford Research Institute, SRI, was charged with putting together the proposal during the Carter years for the official White House study of extraterrestrial intelligence. He testifies about how, at the moment that this proposal was approved by White House staff during the Carter years, that a Pentagon official appeared at Stanford Research Institute and ordered that the project be terminated, or the Pentagon would withdraw its funding for other lucrative contracts at SRI. He states that this action was not only illegal, but preempted the express desire of the Carter White House.
The goal of the study, in the context, there had been such secrecy and a gap in civilian scientific knowledge about the UFO phenomenon. And so the goal of the study was to fill the knowledge gap and to make policy recommendations for the future. It would have drawn upon the best scientific minds available, not only in the United States, but in countries around the world. This project was undertaken openly, of a civilian nature, with transparency. There was no classified aspects. It started at Stanford Research Institute in my offices. The full management of Stanford Research Institute had signed off knowingly on the proposal. Every 2 or 3 weeks I would meet with the White House staff, people in the executive office building. I was signed in and out. The structure of our proposal was that the White House would remain the overall policy director on this research proposal, which was envisioned to be about 3 years long. This project lasted from May 1977, when the initial contacts were made with the White House, until 1977, when it was terminated. The matter came under senior management when the proposal was unlawfully, in terms of illegal interference with contract relations, terminated. They had received direct communications from the Pentagon that if this study went forward, SRI's contracts with the Pentagon would be terminated. And the senior official advised me, and I'm quoting him, to dissimulate, quote, end of quote, and to just dissimulate and pretend I was going along with it, implying that I would keep my job if I did so.
He told us we could not talk about this to anyone, including any of the other crews, our spouses, our family, even amongst each other. So we could not discuss this at all.
It had been discussed with me on numerous occasions. Talked about what could happen to me militarily, and what could happen to me even if I discussed this as a civilian.
That subject just was dropped. It just wasn't discussed.
Anything to discredit you, and you'd never get a promotion, and I'd spend the next 3.5 years up at the North Pole living in a tent checking the weather balloons.
I've made no money from this. I've got nothing but pain and suffering out of talking about it. I've been harassed at my home. This was used against me partially in losing a job once in teaching. I've had a hell of a time after I've told this story, but I continue to tell the story because I think it's important for people to understand that this sort of shit goes on in the government.
If their military personnel were to talk about this, they could be court-martialed, or at least threatened to be court-martialed, to get them to back down and to scare them. And other intimidations would be to hold their paychecks back, transfer them to other bases where a lot of people would not want to go to, like Alaska.
These two gentlemen began to question me about this event. And I remember, saying to them, they were being pretty rough, about it, to be honest with you. And I remember telling them, literally putting my hands up and going, "Wait a minute, fellas, I'm on your side. Whoa, just a minute," because they were not really nice. They were very intimidating and made it quite clear to the point that nothing that was seen, heard, or witnessed that transpired during that was to leave this building. You not to say a word about your co-workers, and off base. You just forget everything you may have seen or heard or whatever concerned with this. It didn't happen. My logbook, I never did see that again. I know we had a new logbook the next day, a brand spanking new one to start with, and that disappeared. They gave me this document where for 5 years, it was absolutely out of the question. I could not leave the country under any circumstances whatsoever. And to leave the state of Virginia, I had to contact the Roanoke office of the FBI and let them know if I just wanted to cross the state line down here to go into North Carolina or just leave the state of Virginia. I had to let the FBI know about it. And that was for 5 years after I was discharged.
I was arrested. I had all my gear taken from me by men in black camis, had no name tags. They were older men, probably in their late 30s or 40s. There were other people, I guess they were government, I don't know. They were there and they had containment suits. And then they put me on a cot that they had, and they had me cuffed with those, they had me cuffed both hands down, and then they had my my legs tied together with those plastic fasteners that the police use. And they had a lieutenant colonel from the Air Force, and he did not identify himself. He might have, I just don't remember. And he told me, if we just took you out in the jungle, they'd never find you out there. And I'm like, well, and I didn't want to say, I didn't want to test him to see if he'd really do that. So I said, yeah. And he's like, you got to sign these papers, and you never saw this, and I don't exist, and this situation never happened. And if you tell anybody, you'll just come up missing. And he was a real abrasive, just a cynical asshole, I guess is the best way to put it.
And we were hit with an aerosol of some sort. I literally could see, I could hear, I could not see, and my nose ran profusely, and my chest got tight. I obviously was not getting into the car properly, so I was beaten, literally hitting in the ribs and pushed, and I was resisting. And I know Sergeant Bastinza was doing the same thing.
And he just said, look, mister, you don't go in and start any rumors and Roswell's, nothing happened out here. And he said, if you do, it'd be real serious problems. I said, I'm a civilian, you can go to hell. And that's where he said, you may be the one going to hell. And then that's when he really told me, he said, somebody will be picking your bones out of the sand if you do that. So
measures have been taken by agencies to terminate people who appear to be inconvenient or troublesome through knowing too much.
I would go interview people that claimed they had seen something and try to convince them they hadn't seen something, or they were, hallucinating or something. Well, if that didn't work, another team would come in and give all the threats and threaten them, their family, and so on and so forth. And they would be in charge of discrediting them, make them look foolish, or so on and so forth. Now, if that didn't work, then there was another team that put an end to that problem, one way or the other. Secretary of Defense Forstall was the first real powerful known person that was eliminated because he was going to release the information. And nobody has ever paid for that crime. That crime had never been really thoroughly investigated by forces to see what happened to him. But most people know that he was thrown out the window of the hospital, and he wasn't killed by being thrown out the window, but he never got up alive.
He was talking about being erased. And I said, man, what do you mean erased? He said, yes. He said, you will be erased. I said, how do you know all this? Or something to that effect. And he said, I know. He said, they'll go after not only you, he said, they'll go after your family. Now, those were his words.
And they're yelling at me, and they're hollering and cursing, and you didn't see anything, and we'll do you and your whole goddamn family. And they're it was basically that for about 8 or 9 hours. These guys, they're just off on their own. There's no oversight, no control, and they just do whatever they want. They don't, I mean, and they're evil, man. These people are evil.
In the military, they do ridicule you, because I was ridiculed a few times. I was told I would never make Master Sergeant. I was on orders for tech, but I was told I would never make Master Sergeant if I brought this crap up again.
The pilots that had seen things and talked about it, some of them were let go. Some of them released from their flying and treated as nutcases and things like that.
At times I used to carry nuclear weapons. In other words, I was mentally fit to carry nuclear weapons, but I'm not mentally fit if I see a UFO. Well, this criticism and this ridicule has, I think, done more to keep the story coming out than almost anything else.
He was sorry he wrote the book. He was sorry he exposed the family to the ridicule, to the lawsuits. It's been very tough on our entire family. He did not want to die, leaving us with these problems. Just hope that the future people such as yourself and me will know what to do with this type of knowledge that this man brought forward. I do say that he is the first man to come forward in a high capacity.
This now brings us to the very big issue of why. Why the secrecy? Why has this been kept away from the public all these years? Many witnesses feel that in the early days, in the 30s and 40s and perhaps 50s, that there was concern for how the average person would react to this information, that perhaps society was not prepared, either on a theological basis or on a social basis, an economic basis, for this information. I will not dispute that fact. I was a child in the 50s, just born in the mid-50s, and I do not know personally what the milieu was that could have affected how people would react. I will say that this is 2001 and not 1951. And in the last half century, that argument is no longer valid. The world has seen humans walk on the moon. My uncle was one of the designers of the lunar module that took Neil Armstrong to the moon. I don't believe anyone living today on this planet would be shocked to hear that there is life in the universe and that we have been visited. I do think that the reasons for secrecy evolved in the 50s up to this date, and they have much more to do with the economic order and the fact that the technologies related to these extraterrestrial vehicles, as well as human breakthroughs unrelated to these extraterrestrial vehicles, have given us energy and propulsion systems within the black budget, compartmented, unacknowledged world, which would have a significant beneficial effect for the world, but would have a deleterious short-term effect for certain special interests. I believe these special interests would include the conventional energy part of our economy, the internal combustion engines, the fossil fuel plants, gas, oil, coal, and ionizing nuclear technology related to nuclear power plants. We know that those technologies are already obsolete. I want to emphasize here that this is not a theory. We have testimony from people who have worked on these projects, within these projects, that can establish the fact that we have fully operational technologies which would enable the world to have no need for these polluting forms of energy.
The first question, and this is probably one of the major reasons why this topic has been kept quiet so long, the first question that one might ask, even the man or woman on the street is going to ask, well, if there are these peoples from other planets and they're here visiting us, how did they get here? Did they have to come at the speed of light and take 4 to hundreds of years to get here, even at the speed of light, or did they come with using some other technology? Well, they're going to find out, of course, that they're using some other technology, and they don't have to travel at the speed of light. They travel at superluminal speeds. semi-instantaneously, if you want to put it in those sort of terms. And so that at that point, you can say, holy mackerel, these technologies could, if used in a peaceful way, benefit our Earth civilization in a major way. And so then where do they get the energy to travel these great speeds? And then we start to look into the energy. They aren't using jet fuel. They aren't using coal to get here. They're using technologies that the average guy on the street, the average physicist in a university doesn't have any clue about, and yet it's very real.
I believe that cold fusion has opened my eyes to yet other possibilities. In a few instances, I can say there are clearly over-unity electromagnetic devices, things that produce more electrical energy out than in. We are not in Kansas any longer. This is spectacular new physics. It indicates that some rather dramatic cracks exist in the foundations of physics. Electromagnetic theory will require radical revision.
Zero-point energy represents about 40 to 50 megawatts of power per cubic inch of space. That's a lot of power. That's 4,600 million watts of power. And if you could tap it at will, then no one would have to sell gasoline or oil anymore. You would just tap into it. It would be like taking and going out to the Great Lakes and taking out one drop and using it. You'd hardly miss it. The fabric of space is like an ocean, an energy ocean in which solid energy is floating on it, and solid energy is the mass. And if that's true, then gravity waves exist. And in fact, everything goes back to Heaviside equations, and it's waves, not particles. And the quantum is now not mass, but time. And if that's true, then there's a whole different, you look at the whole universe in a different light. And then a lot of things become possible that we think impossible within our current understanding of what time and space and thrust and force and all that is.
Yes, there is a history, a long history of over-unity systems. For example, Nikola Tesla had one. Basically, his big magnifying transformer that he had on Long Island was such an over-unity system. So this was one thing we established from the study of the foundations of electromagnetics. You are permitted to have electromagnetic systems that power themselves and their load, and you don't have to put in the energy. They take it from the vacuum, the active vacuum. The bottom line of this is if we'll initiate the negative entropy and let it go, it's just like you punched a hole in the ground and you got a big gusher of oil. You don't have to furnish the pressure and you don't have to furnish the oil. Here it comes. And it comes out in real oil that you can use. And the common dipole in every electrical circuit pours out energy in that fashion. The problem is not how to get enormous energy from the vacuum. Today, we don't have so much big kingdoms. Today, we have big economic programs, big economic countries, or basically, we have cartels. We have a whole set of cartels in an area, interlocking corporations, and behind this, we have a few people who are quite wealthy and who own most things. Historically, as far back as you want to go, we have had cartels. Any time we have a very powerful cartel or set of people that control a lot of things, that resists any means of changing its inflow of control and its inflow of funds and money and its power. You know, everybody's trying to be the big monkey. It's really as simple as that. So what we get is the great Armageddon everybody's been dreading. The energy crisis going right now, in my view, will probably evoke a great Armageddon that we've all feared so long in about 2007. I view this as the greatest strategic threat to survival of the United States and, in fact, of civilization itself that has ever existed in my lifetime. Now, the fools may blow the world from other causes. Don't misunderstand me. But they're going to blow it from this cause. This I'm quite certain of in my own view.
Who's control of petroleum of the world? A lot of people think that Iraq, Iran, and so on and so. They don't. They don't. We control it. Us and the British interests and the other world interests. Well, some people refer to this the secret government. Okay, a group of the richest men in the world control petroleum, has controlled it, and you don't need cars unless you got an internal combustion engine. Well, if you have one of these units, you know, that's about 16 inches long and about 8 inches high and about 10 inches wide, then you don't need to plug into Kit Carson, the local electric company. It burns nothing, no pollution, okay? It never wears out because there's no moving parts. What the people in power right now don't want us to know is that this free energy is available to everybody.
Mark McCandlish is an accomplished aerospace illustrator and has worked for many of the top aerospace corporations in the United States. His colleague, Brad Sorensen, with whom he studied, has been inside a facility at the then Norton Air Force Base where there were alien reproduction vehicles, or ARVs, that were fully operational and hovering there. In his testimony, you will learn that we not only have operational anti-gravity propulsion devices, but have had them for many, many years, and that they have been developed through the study, in part, of extraterrestrial vehicles over the past 50 years.
They had a big black curtain that divided the hangar into two different areas, and that behind these curtains was another big area, and inside this area they had all the lights turned off, and they go in, they turn the lights on, and here are 3 flying saucers floating off the floor. No cables suspended from the ceiling holding them up, no landing gear underneath, just floating, hovering above the floor. And they had little exhibits. They had a TV, a little videotape running showing the smallest of the 3 vehicles sitting out in the desert, presumably over a dry lake bed someplace like Area 51. And it showed this vehicle making 3 little quick hopping motions like that, and then accelerating straight up and out of sight until you couldn't see it, and completely disappearing from view in just a couple of seconds. I mean, just boom, no sound, no sonic boom, nothing. They had a cutaway illustration, pretty much like the one I'll show you in a little bit, that showed what the internal components of this vehicle were. And they had some of the panels taken off so you could actually look in and see oxygen tanks and a little robotic arm that could extend out from the side of the vehicle for collecting samples and things. So obviously, this is a vehicle that not only is capable of flying around through the atmosphere, but it's also capable of going out to space and collecting samples. And it's using a type of propulsion system that doesn't make any noise. As far as he could see, it had no moving parts, and didn't have any exhaust gases or fuel to be expended. It was just there, hovering. Well, the synthetic vision system that's on the AR, what they called the alien reproduction vehicle, it was also nicknamed the Flux Liner. This anti-gravity propulsion system, this flying saucer, one of 3 that were in this hangar at Norton Air Force Base. This synthetic vision system uses the same kind of technology as the gun slaving system that they have in the Apache helicopter, except in this case you have 2 cameras, and it picks any pair of the cameras in that pattern of 6 that are around the circumference, including the one on the top. Whichever pair most closely matches the orientation of the pilot's head. This shows the cutaway. You can see the 4 ejection seats. Actually, there are 2 facing us, but there are also 2 that are sort of facing away from us on the other side of that central column. You can see the oxygen tanks down here in the corner that actually go all the way around the inside of the skirt.
There's also another set of oxygen tanks that are inside the crew compartment sphere. Brad said a couple things about this system. Now, I should also describe, he said there were 3 vehicles. The first one, the smallest one, the one was partially taken apart, the one that was shown in the video that was running in this hangar, November 12, 1988 at Norton Air Force Base, was about 24 feet in diameter at its widest part, right at the base of that flange. The next biggest one was 60 feet in diameter at the base. Oh, by the way, and the largest of 3 vehicles was about 120 to 130 feet in diameter. I mean, that's massive when you think about it. It's just huge. Brad said that in this exhibit at Norton Air Force Base that a 3-star general said that these vehicles were capable of doing light speed or better. I said, well, so when did you see this? And he says, I saw it in 1973. I said, well, where? When? How do you know? When did you see it? He says, well, I was a crew chief. He said, I worked on Bill Scott's plane when he was a test pilot. And he says, one night my ship supervisor said to me, go out to North Base. They've got a power unit out there, a ground power unit for an aircraft that's leaking or failed or something. So we need to take a tow vehicle out there, go out, pick it up, bring it back. Well, instead, what happened is he comes up off the dry lake bed, rolls right up on the tarmac, and is going down these rows of hangars. They're all Quonset-style hangars back then. And he stops in front of the first one with the doors cracked, expecting to find this defective ground power unit. And what does he see? He sees this flying saucer sitting in the hangar, hovering off the ground. So I said, well, what happened? He says, well, this thing, was flat on the bottom, sloping sides, had little cameras in these little plastic domes all over, and there was a door on the side. And he says, I wasn't there for 15 seconds, and I heard footsteps running up to me. Before I could even turn around and look, he says, there was a machine gun barrel at my throat, another one over here, and he says, a gruff voice says, close your eyes and get on the ground, or we're going to blow your head off. So they put a hood over his head, blindfolded him, hauled him off, and they spent 18 hours debriefing him.
I can discuss Norton Air Force Base, and that as a result of all the military airlift command bases under me for their facilities, that there was one facility at Norton Air Force Base that was close hold. Not even the wing commander there could know what was going on. And during that time period, throughout my career, it was always rumored by the pilots that that was a cover for, in fact, a location of one UFO craft. And the reason for that location was folks that could come out, land at Norton, play golf, be part of a golf tournament and so forth, and during that process could go by the facility and actually see the UFO.
Don Phillips is an Air Force military man. He worked with Kelly Johnson at the Skunk Works, Lockheed, as a young man. His testimony is conclusive. He goes into tremendous detail about the fact that we not only have these devices, that we have studied them, and that we have had tremendous technological advances from the study of these extraterrestrial vehicles.
I know there were 2 prominent people that, to this day, I still know, that founded what we call Area 51. They're 2 friends. The idea that there is craft being worked on is not just an idea. Yes, there was craft there. I've talked to others that have worked on it. There's different levels there. What you see on the surface is not representative of all of the research areas that are there. One of our contract scientists for our private concern, Light City Technologies Incorporated, he worked with them. He worked with a couple of those technologies while he was with a very prominent intelligence agency of the United States government. We put it to use, but it took us a long time to figure out what it was, and then figure out how we can use it, and then what to use it for. And are those products useful for humanity?
In conclusion, I would like to state that this is a matter of the utmost significance to the American people, but also to peoples throughout the world. We can establish now that we are not alone. It can be proven that there are technologies which could give us a new and sustainable civilization. And we are certain that the secrecy surrounding this issue constitutes a threat to the national security and to the security of the whole entire world. Specific actions which I would recommend. I would recommend that our scientific institutions, such as the National Science Foundation, the National Academy of Sciences, and others around the world, look into this subject with an impartial and objective view to getting to the bottom of the facts. You cannot dismiss over 100 people's testimony who range from brigadier generals to colonels to air traffic controllers at strategic air command facilities in a cavalier fashion. There can be no denying that there is something going on. It at the minimum deserves a serious, well-funded scientific inquiry. In addition, I believe that the United States Congress and the United Nations, as well as the parliaments of the United Kingdom and other advanced countries, need to have hearings on this subject. There are thousands of prospective witnesses to this whole matter. They will come forward if they are protected, if there is an official and serious and honest inquiry that is oriented towards getting to the truth. In addition, I ask that the President of the United States take executive action to form a commission to openly study this matter, and also that he issue executive orders releasing people from national security oaths or penalties for coming forward with information regarding these projects. It is my opinion that because these projects have escaped appropriate legal constitutional oversight, they are a priori null and void from a legal point of view. However, many of the witnesses would feel more comfortable coming forward if there was action on their behalf by the President as well as by the Congress. I also wish to emphasize that the President of the United States needs to be fully informed on these and related issues. We have learned that a number of presidents in the past, through high-level contacts to them, have been left in the dark on this very important issue. This cannot be allowed to continue. Lastly, I would welcome the input from scientists, from government officials around the world, so that we can cooperate in any way possible to allow this information to come forward. I would also invite other people who may gain access to this briefing video to contact me if they are a witness, if they have been within the military, the intelligence, or corporate world and have had direct first-hand knowledge of these projects. It is only through many people coming together courageously that we will be able to establish the truth and create the world that we wish to have for our children and our children's children. Thank you very much.
This whole project of bringing this out in the open will probably take other people too. But myself, I'm 73 years old, and I've had a good life and no regrets, and I've loved this country, and I've been a Christian all my life since I was about 11 years old, and so I believe God wants this known. And I believe the cosmos wants this known.
It was a real eye-opener, how deep the secrecy goes, how deep the cover-up is.
It still bothers me that I've seen all this, I know all this, and like I'm walking around like with the answer, and nobody wants to ask the question to get the answer, and it kind of irritates me a little bit.
If the truth is going to come out sooner or later.
I think it's long past time to open this up to the public.
I think it's time for us to act to end this charade.
It's definitely time to make this disclosure on this. It's been kept secret too long.
One of the things that I'm upset about is that good people are forced to do illegal things, and I believe that this information should be given to the American public.
Give us information to the young people of the world in this country. They want to hear it. They want it. Give it to them. Don't hide to them, tell lies and make stories. They're not stupid.
Eventually, there's going to be something happen that will make all of them have egg all over their face, and they're going to have to admit that they haven't been truthful at all.
This should be the subject of rigorous scientific investigation and not the subject of rubbishing by tabloid newspapers.
It's the discovery of the lifetime of humankind, isn't it? To find out that we're not here alone.
It's a truth that the entire world has to be informed about, and that truth is man is not alone.